Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are talking about the intersection of science and mythology, particularly with respect to the historic observation of the skies. And to guide us through that journey, we have Duane Hamacher, an astronomer at the University of Melbourne, who has taken a keen interest in Indigenous traditions, particularly the storytelling, which seems to extend back perhaps tens, God, maybe even 100,000 years into the past. And it turns out that these ancestral traditions were encoding not just fairy tale information, not even just practical knowledge about the skies, but also scientific information. So a number of astrophysicists today are trying to reconstruct what happened with various celestial objects, and they're looking to the past to make sense of that. So there's a number of angles here. We also really wanted to understand why in the world so many different traditions have come up with the same mythologies for the star systems in the sky, for the different constellations. Why have people been talking about a bull and a hunter in the sky in multiple different traditions since tens of thousands of years ago? That's really bizarre. Is it a archetypical Jungian type thing? Is there a conserved lineage of stories that's really been passed along? So we get into all of that. It's pretty cool.
And it's just something that intuitively makes sense because I think that there is a slow shift where people are coming around to realize that mythology contains within it valuable knowledge. And Shiloh and I have made the case on the show many times before that it's actually, when you look closely, it's hard to tell the difference between, science as a mythology and traditional mythology as mythology. And we have different actors and we have different stories that we tell. But the fact is that what we're doing is we're trying to take the things that we see in the world and make sense of them.
It's funny how in both instances, the mystical can creep in at the edges of what's unknown, right? A lot of these mythological stories encode, like I said, real practical knowledge about how to live your life, but they can also get corrupted in various mystical ways, right? Where the magic takes the spotlight away. And I think we see the same thing happen in our modern mythology, which is science as far as we can tell. Not to say that myth means that it's garbage. It just means that it's the best navigational narrative that we can construct at any given moment, and that there is a tradition of passing that along to the next generation. When you show up to do your PhD, you're given a set of stories about the experimental system that you're studying, and you don't really have a ton of time to, go back and check out every single piece of that story. You just kind of take it on and try to develop it into the next
And
generation.
accept that it's functional, which is, I think, the most key aspect of this, which is that mythology is a functional encoding of information. And we get into all of that in the episode. If you like Duane's work, then consider buying his book. We have a link in the description through an Amazon affiliate program. And so if you buy his book about the first astronomers, which he wrote with some indigenous astronomers that he has met through his research, and touches upon the traditions all over the world, from Greenland to Africa to the Pacific Islands, that's in the description. You can help support the podcast.
He's also giving away all of that money to those indigenous communities, so it's not just a cash cow
Exactly.
in any way.
And speaking of cash cows, if you enjoy the podcast and you'd like to support us, consider coming over to patreon.com. I say cash cow with tongue firmly in cheek because Patreon is the model that we have chosen to make this podcast functional. We don't want to put advertisements on it. We don't want to have sponsors. We've come to really be frustrated by the idea that content is this thing that fills space between people trying to sell you things. I think that that's a really toxic and damaging way that the world has been constructed, because the internet is now just the vessel to be able to sell you things that the algorithms have decided that you might want. We don't want to do that to you. We don't want to play that game. We believe that it's possible to make a fantastic podcast that brings people joy and meaning and satisfaction and be rewarded by their direct support. In return, you get to join our absolutely fantastic community of patrons. We have people that have been coming to our patron chat since day one. We launched this
Every Sunday.
every single Sunday. We changed the time a couple times, but literally we've had people that have come every single time. They're regulars. They're amazing people. You know who you are. I love seeing everybody every week. We've had a really interesting influx of new people from all sorts of fields, people that are professional researchers, people that are studying neuroscience, people that are studying philosophy, people that are doing independent research projects. And we kind of get together every week and we just piece through the ideas. And now there's like a breakout session that's happening in Discord. And so it's really turning into a community where once a week everybody gathers and we just share what we've been thinking about. And if you join the Patreon, you get to participate. And so I'd love to see you there.
Also, we are planning our second Demystify Sci conference next summer, the weekend of June 13th, I believe. And there will be more details about that soon. We're not going to put tickets up for sale for quite a while, but I want you to start thinking about it. There's going to be very limited seats, and it's going to be an epic lineup of people. So think about it. And you can support the podcast that way. But in general, share the podcast to people. Tell somebody about it. By the way, we got a write-up in The Atlantic recently. That was really cool. Thank you guys for helping out with that.
Not only that, but we were also number 18 in the podcast science charts.
Top 20.
Yeah,
So
we're making it.
Apparently we're a legitimate scientific podcast at this point.
We still have not figured out lighting for when it's getting dark.
I was going to say, yeah, we could use some help keeping the lights on around here, literally. No, we're on the road right now. We're down in San Francisco still. And obviously, we're going to LA at the end of the week to do some filming, another podcast.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and then also consider, if you are in the Bay Area, Gopi Vijaya, podcast guest from a couple months back, is hosting his Renewal of Science conference in Menlo Park. I believe that it's the weekend of October 31st. And so if you're in the area, I think I'm going to be there. Shiloh might be there. And it might be an opportunity to come say hi, hang out, and see what new ideas are renewing science.
All right, guys. I hope you enjoy our conversation with Duane, and we'll see you next time.
Peace out.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Can we tell people what the subjects are that you spend a lot of time thinking about?
Yes. So memory and orality is a big part of what I do. It's weird. It's a little bit adjacent to what I do. It's sort of how you take this knowledge and you embody that in a structured form and pass that on. But it's really important to think about, because if we're going to understand how knowledge is passed on, we have to get over these misinformed ideas about what we think mythology is.
So would you say that you study stories?
I absolutely study stories and I unpack stories, and that's a lot of the excitement that comes out of that. And it's really amazing because we so often think about mythology as, we think myth is the opposite of fact. And that's how it's used colloquially, right? But mythology is a study of spoken stories. And storytelling is how, you know this better than anybody, you have to tell a story, right? It's how you engage people in a way where they're going to remember what's being told to them, how they're going to be able to synthesize lots of details about things that you might not think relate to each other, that all do relate to each other. How do you do that? How do you take a huge system of knowledge? How do you show how those things work together? How do you synthesize that? And how do you pass that on through multiple generations while maintaining vitality when you don't have written records, you don't have websites, you don't have books? You have to pass it on orally. Well, you create stories, you create songs, you create art, you create all these different types of mediums where you're able to convey this knowledge in different ways. But it takes a lot of training to be able to do that. But that's how humans have been doing this for our entire existence. But today we just tend to think of all this stuff as, it's myth. Oh, it's just stories. Well, who cares? That's not real. We've really thrown the baby out with the bathwater within the sciences by just sort of looking at mythology and saying, no, there's nothing there of any value because there's some supernatural element or something, completely misinterpreting what it's all about. So that's a lot of the exciting stuff that I've been getting into.
How far back are we talking about with some of these stories? Can you put a date on the origin?
Oh, this is where it gets fun. This is where it gets really fun. So some of these stories describe natural events. natural events that can be dated scientifically. And we have identified stories that talk about meteorite impacts that go back 4,000 or 5,000 years, about volcanic eruptions that go back 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 years. There's stuff that goes back even further than that. And that's what I find really amazing about all this, is we think that oral tradition can't last very long because we all play that stupid game in grade school, telephones, we call it in the States, of course, where you have a line of kids and the teacher whispers something in one kid's ear and it's supposed to be passed down, and there's always some smart ass halfway through. It's got to change it or whatever, and it's this idea about how hearsay works. But the critical element to that that's not taken into account is if there is reward for doing it correctly or having that information come down accurately and punishment for being done incorrectly, you're going to get very different results from that. But when you have a culture and a society where information is passed on orally, there are lots of rules around that. There's lots of different ways you engage that knowledge, and there's certain ways in which only certain people are allowed to pass that knowledge on because they've proven themselves capable and able of doing that, which, I don't want to, a whole other line, tangent will go down to ties into neurodivergence with that, and the importance of neurodivergence in human history with orality and memory and art. But, we tend to think these things can't last very long when the reality is information encoded in these old traditions can last over 10, 15,000 years, and we have direct evidence of that.
Do you suspect it could go back even further than that?
Even further than that. I mean, there are things talking about megafauna. Megafauna, in many parts of Australia haven't been around for tens of thousands of years. We're talking 30, 40,000 years. But yet the stories still talk about these megafauna. There are volcanic eruptions that go back 17,000 years that are described in detail about how they formed, what happened, all the different characteristics about the environment at the time, which are different to what they are now, but would have been back then, which, we're talking back in the Ice Age. I published a paper last year with some colleagues that was really exciting because we showed some Aboriginal traditions, some stories that were recorded in Tasmania back in the 1830s. And the people had been talking about a couple of different things. One of them was that Tasmania wasn't always an island, that it used to be part of the mainland, and that it was an island for a while before the ocean came in and formed what's now the Bass Strait. But also, not just that, which that alone can be dated back 10 to 12,000 years. But what's also really cool is they talk about the presence of a great south star. Now, great south star being a bright star near the south celestial pole. There is no bright star near the south celestial pole. There is in the northern hemisphere, Polaris, of course, used for navigation. The southern hemisphere, we don't have one. So we have to use the Southern Cross and the pointer stars and triangulate things. And we've got all these little different ways we can sort of work out that direction. But there is no bright star near the south celestial pole. But the stories talk about, the sun and the moon being a man and a woman. And their first two children are the two brightest stars in the sky, Moani and Andromeda, which are the stars Sirius and Canopus. Now, Canopus, Moani, would have been very close to the south celestial pole if you go back 12, 13,000 years ago, because of precession of the equinoxes. This wobble the Earth does as it rotates, traces out this big circle every 26,000 years. Well, right now, the celestial pole is pointing off in an empty patch of the sky. We go back 10, 12 to 13,000 years ago, it would have been pointing very close to Canopus. So Canopus would have been about the width of your fist at arm's length. So a bright star in the south. So those two lines of evidence both coincide with the time period of around 12,000 years ago. And the elders talk about how that star is no longer a great south star. It's sort of in a different position now. So there's these stories about natural conditions and natural events that go back so far. It blows our mind to think about.
Do you have a sense of what the stars meant to these people? Were they maps for telling stories, or did they have navigational importance primarily, or what was the role of the stars in these earliest traditions? Are there multiple layers of meaning to these myths, so you could have practical knowledge as well as like what's the use of the stars to these people, as best you can tell?
Yes, everything. This is one of the great things about learning indigenous astronomy. The elders, what they talk about is how everything in the land is reflected in the sky. As is above, so is below. And this is a theme you find all around the world. Lakota people of the northern Midwest, like Minnesota area, they have a term for this called Kapemni, as above, so below. So these stars were used for everything. They were used as a timepiece. How do you measure time? I mean, think about it. How do you actually measure time when we don't have watches or phones or anything? How do we do this? Well, we look to the sun, we look to the moon, we look to the stars. Whether you're going to be looking at time over the course of a day, where the sun's position is going to be, or the moon over a month, or the stars over a year, or even the sun as it goes back and forth over a year, longer period time scales, all of that is discussed in Indigenous astronomy. But it's also about space. How do you navigate? How do you go from point A to point B? And there's different ways of doing that, and we can unpack that a bit later. There's, follow a particular star, second star to the right, straight on to morning kind of thing. There's also about mapping out the landscape in the stars and using that as a mnemonic. There is the timing of when stars rise or set, where they're going to be at a significant time of the day, time of the year. So if you look at when a star rises at sunset, that particular time of the year may coincide to the behavior pattern of a specific animal. Maybe it's breeding cycle or changing weather patterns as seasons change. But the stars are really useful in acting like a scientific textbook. So if you want to have everything around you is working, you can look at the stars to figure that out. You can use the phases of the moon to work out the tides. You can look to the stars to figure out seasonal change. You can look at the way the stars twinkle to forecast weather. All these different elements that we think of as broadly scientific, understanding the world around us and how we can make sense of that. But then there's also all of the social rules, all the social strata. How do we behave? What are the rules that guide how we behave? What are the expectations? You create stories and laws in that, which can be reflected in the stars. So the stars are a scientific textbook. They're a law book. They're a map. They're a timepiece. There's probably about another dozen things could rattle off, but they're also a great memory space. And that's one of the things I've been really excited about getting into, is the idea of mnemonic and memory.
Yeah, so at the beginning you said that there was something special about the way that these stories were encoded that allowed them to be maintained for these long periods of time. Because if we're talking about a story that is describing an event or a climactic period that was 17,000 years ago, and somebody is collecting it in the present day or even a couple hundred years ago, we're still in the position where that story has survived for long enough for somebody to find it among the indigenous people. And so what allows a story to survive for 17,000 years in a way that accurately captures the thing that happened?
It has to have practical function. And this is where the sciences really do themselves a bit of a disservice. So in the sciences, we, as you both know, we think about information and data in a particular way, right? And one of the things that we reject is the idea of supernatural causation. Why does the world work the way that it does? Oh, because God made it that way. That's not an explanation, so we reject that. Now, in a lot of these stories, what we often think of as myth, there is supernatural elements to that. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but one of the main ones is it's outside the day-to-day experience. It's memorable. That's what we can think of it. When you have these myths, they tend to include humans morphing into animals and superhuman feats of strength and flying and cosmic travel. These are things that are highly memorable. It's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's not boring, mundane stuff. You're not going to memorize that. Give a poor student a physics textbook and have them memorize it, they're going to hate it. but give them a great story that has that information encoded within it, and they're going to remember that. So that knowledge has to have a practical function. And that's one thing that I think we lose sight of in the sciences is looking at these stories and thinking, oh, they're just myths and legends. There's nothing important there. But the elders and the people who created these stories had a purpose in mind, and it is pragmatic. So for that knowledge to be passed on over time, there has to be purpose, there has to be meaning, there has to be importance for that. And once we understand that and can see how that works, then we can understand how these knowledges can be passed on for so long. There's other elements to that, like the method of loci, which is an incredibly powerful tool that we utilize in our minds about being able to associate memory to place. But being able to have knowledge that has purpose, that has meaning, that has importance, and see the way that it's passed on, you can clearly see how and why it could last as long as it does. But the thing that's important to remember about it is for the knowledge to be pragmatic, it's got to have some kind of practical use. So it describes the world around us, but the world around us is dynamic and evolving. It's not the same all the time, right? We go through ice ages, things happen, natural events. So the knowledge itself, the traditions about that also have to change over time. So these indigenous knowledges and what we think of as myths, they're also dynamic. But sometimes you're going to get bits of information that remain in there. It's something I think of as like vestigial information within some of these stories. And that Great South Star might not have a practical purpose now because you can't navigate using a Great South Star. There is no Great South Star. But the lesson about what that star was telling you, maybe in a social capacity, still has importance. It still has application. That's why it still survived and hasn't just been relegated to, some long lost world that we don't think about anymore.
This is a question that Shiloh and I play with all the time. And I wonder if you've thought a lot about the difference between myth and mysticism.
Yeah, I don't. There's such a strange crossover between them. Maybe it's not so strange, actually. I think for a scientist, we can think it's strange. But when you're trying to understand things that are memorable in people's experiences, you can start to really see how they link together. So with a lot of this indigenous knowledge, that ties into what we think of as science. That's been my main focus the last 16, 17 years, is unpacking the science behind the indigenous knowledge. But science and indigenous knowledge as a Venn diagram is not a perfect circle. They're not completely overlapped, but they're not completely separate. There is a crossover.
Well, when you were explaining that it's this tradition that's kept by certain people, it actually reminded me a lot of science, where you have these experts that are carrying on this tradition. Like, we often don't think of science as a modern mythology, but in some sense it is, because there's a conserved set of stories that does evolve over time. I mean, ideally it evolves in some highly objective way where we're comparing our knowledge against new evidence that comes onto the landscape. But at the same time, we're wrong a lot of the time in science, and we have to adjust and reorient. So we're telling the story, but we're acting as if it's true the whole time. If you go back, I don't know, if you go back 500 years, let's say, the science would have said that, maybe it's more than 500 years, but if you would have gone back before Galileo, the science would have told you that the Earth was at the center of the solar system. And that would have been the mythology that everybody adhered to. And there's something binding about that, I feel like, from a social sense. And the mythologies seem to do the same thing in these ancient traditions. But the fact that there's keepers of this knowledge seems very parallel to me with modern science.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird situation, a funny one, because so much of modern science was so closely entangled with religion, and not just spirituality in a generic sense, but major, powerful world religions. Aristotle said the cosmos were invariable and unchanging, despite the fact that you can see the cosmos changing. Things are variable. But that doctrine held for, was it 1,500 years, longer than that, 1,700 years, before people were like, well, hang on, we can clearly see that it's not. Galileo points his telescope to Jupiter. and he sees moons going around Jupiter. He sees rings around Saturn. He sees things on the moon. He sees the craters on the moon.
The phases of Venus.
Phases of Venus, exactly right, which don't make sense in a geocentric universe where the Earth is the center, but that was considered the established fact, and you didn't argue that. And if you did, bad things could happen to you.
But that's so interesting that somebody has to defend that narrative. It seems like the social glue, the ability for it to function as a social glue, it depends on everybody subscribing to the same story. Like, that seems really, really important. And I feel like the defensiveness of academic scientists is an inherited feature of something that was predating it, almost certainly. Like, you can't just go changing the myths around inside of a culture. That must have been somewhat verboten, right?
I think that if the myths are necessary for the preservation of some functional idea, then it makes sense that you would maintain a conserved class of people throughout every single society that has the role of maintaining these core stories. And this is kind of why I was trying to point to the difference between myth and mysticism. Because I feel like myth, in the way that I've encountered it, is a very functional story. Like, it encodes some kind of ancient information that is either
how to live, how to succeed, how to have a successful life.
Yeah, or like how to navigate. But mysticism has this other edge to it, which is this fog of mystery that's placed over the knowledge, where its power comes not from the clarity, but from the obscurity. And so it's like these two forces play in parallel with one another, where one is about function and the other is about, I don't know, like magic in some ways.
Yeah, it's remarkable to think about, because when I'm working in this particular field, a lot of Native American communities, First Nations communities across the U.S. refer to it as star medicine. That's how they refer to the knowledge of star medicine. Other places refer to it as star magic. Medicine, magic, science, they've all got a different weighting in how we think about those in today's terms. But for those cultures, I mean, these are described in English terms, right? We're trying to take something that was not developed or designed to be, described or discussed in English. We're putting it in English. So we have a very limited vocabulary. There's a lot of limitations within English itself, right? We're kind of a mongrel language anyway, right? We still have our language from French. But so when you're trying to look at this sort of stuff and describe it in English, we are really at a loss to be able to do this very accurately. So you have to look at the languages in which the knowledge was developed in the first place. And when you understand it within those contexts, then it no longer seems like it's weirdly juxtaposed. It makes perfect sense. But if you're not embedded within those languages and within those cultures to understand how and why it works, and you don't have that syntax, then it's going to sound kind of weird. Oh, we're talking about star medicine. How is it medicine? Oh, what do you mean? Oh, this is mysticism. We can't do this in science. What are we doing here? It's like we're really missing the point of all of this when we do that. And yeah, you're right. These stories, these myths, if you want, and this is a funny thing. I used to, for many years, hate the term mythology because of the negative connotations it had. I said, don't ever use that term. Don't say it. But nowadays, I'm like, screw it. We're taking it back. I'm tired of myth being used as the opposite of fact. Myth is powerful. Myth is mnemonic. Myth has a lot of functions that we need to reconnect with, and not in the way people might think.
I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the science thing, is that I think that we still have myth alive in our day and age. We have some bedrock grip on reality that we all share, whether it's that the sun is at the center of the solar system. We have some shared understanding of how things work until it changes, until we have some new conception of how that works. And so,
I think that the example of the sun at the center of the solar system is a hard example because
it's unlikely to change in the future.
But if you look at something like embryogenesis, right, and you get into the very specific esoteric details of the story that we tell about how a collection of cells grows into an organism, There's a lot of fuzzy logic there. There's a lot of pieces that are not completely known. There's a lot of forces at play that we don't fully understand. Something that we recently came across is that if you shield the magnetic field from a developing embryo, it doesn't develop properly, which is crazy because it's a really weak magnetic field. And so if you put, I think it was like zebrafish embryos into a Faraday cage, they develop abnormally. And so there's all this stuff that we don't know, and yet we tell a story that is complete. We're like, we basically have embryogenesis in the bag. And so that's the place where you can look at it and you can be like, well, hold on a second. Is this more robust than myth, or is this just an empirical myth?
Sometimes they update wildly too. You know, the story of the moon, for instance, or how the dinosaurs died, right? That changed significantly since I was a kid. The Chicxulub story, that happened in the mid-2000s, from what I can tell, that the scientific community got behind it and it became a sort of consensus myth.
What was it before that? They just kind of like went away?
They were like, well, maybe it was volcanism, maybe there was an asteroid, maybe there was climate change of some sort. There was much more ambiguity in it. I'm not sure that a flag was planted as strongly, but I just mean that this is a story that we treat as if it is true until we realize that it's not and something else needs to happen. And so I imagine mythology is very similar in the past, where it's like, this is the way that we see the world functioning until we understand something new about it. I just don't think they're as different as people think they are. That's all.
They're not, you know, but it's funny because we talk about this in the sciences. There's a certain kind of confidence we have. Oh, this is how things form. This is what we know. And then tomorrow we find something totally different. We're like, so we were wrong. So this is how it works now. Like,
but we're definitely right now.
We're definitely right now. You know, the idea about the moon. How did the moon get here? How did it form? And then now the best hypothesis, Thea, and there was this impact with the Earth, and which is wild to think about, you know. But I mean,
yeah, exactly. All these huge stories, they change though, right? And the closer you look at one of them, no matter how well accepted it is, there's little cracks in a lot of these that leave room for adaptations in the future.
I mean, you read geology stories from 100 years ago, and it's basically the equivalent of banging rocks together. Like, these people had no idea. It was just absolutely nonsensical.
Right, and you're telling me that we're not going to have a much better idea 300 years or 1,000 years from now about all of these huge stories that we take as bedrock truth. I can't help but see them as the modern mythology. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way, because I don't think mythology is some vapid fairy tale stuff either. But that's really fascinating to me.
It just seems to imply that it's at the core of our societies. Go ahead.
It is. You know, we think back in the late 1800s when we thought that we know pretty much everything about physics or natural philosophy, that, you know, now it's just, we know everything there is to know about it. Now it's just fine tuning it. And then over the next 15, 20 years, Einstein publishes special relativity, Brownian motion, photoelectric effect, the whole era of scientists publishing about quantum mechanics and realizing that, hang on, what? What is this? It revolutionized physics, told us that what we thought we know isn't, well, I wouldn't say it wasn't close. You know, we started with something very simple ideas about things, and we're teasing out amazing complexity from that. And that's everything that we do. I talk about it when I'm teaching physics with students, first year physics. I had them start to do derivations of equations. I can say, well, I can give you an equation, and you can know that you have to use it. But where does it come from? Like, where does this equation come from? Well, let's look at this. So we've got position, change in position over time is velocity, change in velocity over time is acceleration. We have this, and we can form a differential equation. We integrate it, and all of a sudden we get these amazing complex equations out of something that seems so simple. And that's a great thing I love about science is, yeah, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, our ideas about things compared to what we know now, what we think we know now, seem incredibly simple. But tease out this amazing complexity. The evolution of life itself. I mean, look at us, look at our brains, look at the things around us that came out of single-celled organisms billions of years ago. The amazing complexity that comes out of that. So, you know, when it comes to our understanding of the world around us, it's always going to be more complex, and it's always going to challenge what we think we know. But kind of going back to what you were mentioning before, this almost an idea of gatekeeping. Why is it only certain people are allowed to know certain kinds of information? Well, if we go back and we look at cultures and societies in the ancient past, and this still applies with many cultures that are living and thriving today, but we look at the whole history of humanity, going back a few 100,000 years, however long it was ago that we evolved to be Homo sapiens sapiens. Written language is something that's extremely new, and only a couple of cultures developed it. Others have adapted it or adopted it, but throughout humans' history, we didn't have writing. We didn't need it. Our brains evolved in a particular way to be able to memorize huge amounts of information, to be able to see patterns and recognize patterns and things. We're amazing pattern-seeking creatures. And when you understand the context of mythology and art and all these ancient sites that get thrown into this world of mysticism, which nowadays gets blown up into aliens and all kinds of ridiculous crap like that, you understand these ideas about orality. You understand these ideas about the method of loci and about mnemonic theory. You understand, which is evolving, but we start to get a better idea of how that works. We can see, oh, this is why those things were built. This is why those things work the way they do. And it's not this really wild, complex idea. It's a very simple idea that's extremely effective. And we don't need to go back to Göbekli Tepe and Stonehenge and start conjuring up ancient lost civilizations that were highly advanced and aliens and all this other kind of rubbish.
But it's so much fun.
It's fun. I know.
Those books are fun reads, though. They're bestsellers for a reason. It's dangerous.
It ties back to why. Yeah. Well, it ties back to why it's important that certain people have this knowledge to maintain rigor, to maintain integrity of that knowledge. Because we see what happens in society today, everybody's got access to this knowledge and everybody can share. And now we got a significant portion of the world who thinks the earth is flat. In 2024, we have to have arguments about why the earth isn't flat.
I think that's some CIA gatekeeping. So
are there really people? Is there a significant fraction of people? Well, I was thinking, though, this oral way of keeping records is really dangerous, right? I think we can miss out. Like, it's really interesting to me that our human history seems to only go back to the last ice age, right? It's very difficult to talk to any archaeologists or anybody and get a sense of what the culture was like prior to the last ice age. And I feel like that's because the stories have gotten. You're not so convinced. You think we can?
I mean, it's the ice age is a barrier for a couple of reasons. First off, humanity kind of like went through a bottleneck. Our population shrunk to critically low levels during the ice age, and I'm sure a lot of things were lost during that because of the harsh environmental conditions. But like I said before, we can identify oral traditions that are still being passed down today, or at least within the last 150 years, that talk about conditions that go way back before the last ice age. There were ice ages before this last one, but you're talking oral traditions that can go back 30, 40,000 years. There's elements of information in these knowledges that go back. So as an example, about a week and a half ago, I was out in Alice Springs, middle of Australia, and I went to Palm Valley. Beautiful place. Now, Palm Valley looks to an outsider like a place you would walk into and you'd expect at any moment to see dinosaurs coming out of the bush. Right? It looks like one of those old 1960s era, cavemen and dinosaurs fighting battles together. It's this valley in this beautiful red rock where you have all these palms. Now you're out in the middle of the desert. You don't see these kinds of trees out there. But in this little valley area, and when I say valley, I'm not talking like tens of miles long. I'm talking like a mile. That's it. Just this little stretch in this little valley, right, of these types of cabbage palms. And they are not indigenous to the area. The cabbage palms, the nearest ones, are from the Gulf of Carpentaria, thousands of kilometers away, right? But the Aranda people there talked about how, it was their ancestors from the north who brought those a long time ago. That's how they described it. Our ancestors who came from the north brought this back in the, time immemorial kind of thing. And it was only relatively recently that scientists did genetic testing of it and found out that, yeah, these cabbage palms actually come from the Gulf of Carpentaria, and they were brought down here 33,000 years ago.
Woo!
30,000 years ago,
Wow,
right?
that's
And
insane.
there are cultures that talk about, our ancestors come from a great land far to the north. There's people in the north of Australia talking about how our ancestors came from further off in the north. This is talking about the human migration to Australia 50, 60 plus thousand years ago.
So there was like another continent there, right? Is it the Sundaland or something like that?
Well, there was Sahul,
Sahul,
and Sunda and Sahul, right? So Sunda was all of Southeast Asia, which believed around the time the humans first started, modern humans first started coming. Because remember, there were already there were Neanderthals, there were Denisovans, there were the hobbits and Flores, that go back 700 plus thousand years. This is way back before modern humans.
It was like millions of years ago. Or is this millions of years ago?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Millions and hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? But those land masses, the ocean was much lower than it is today. So all of Southeast Asia was pretty much one big land mass with some islands, and then New Guinea, Australia, and Tasmania was all one giant landmass called Sahul, right? And now the Gulf of Carpentaria was a lake. Tasmania was part of Australia. It was all one giant landmass.
Do you see a memory of that? Traces of a memory of that?
Yes.
That's
yes,
crazy.
You do see traces, memories of that, and this is what I'm talking about. There's bits of this knowledge and information that have been passed down for that long. Recently in Victoria, there was a cave that was found and surveyed and studied, excavated. And they had shown in there that knowledge had been passed down continually. No big gaps. It had been continual use for 12,000 years, probably before that. But remember, the ice comes in, you wind up getting these conditions where, around 12,000 years ago, things started to change after the end of the last ice age. But you go back even that far, and that was continual use. And this ties into this whole method of loci, which when we think about caves, and deep inside the backs of these caves, there's all this rock art, there's all these what look like ceremonial sites. Humans weren't living in that. Those weren't areas where you lived day to day. They were very hard to get to. And you see people trying to get, like, how the hell did people get back into that way back then? Crawling and climbing and stuff. This isn't like I'm going to walk into my house. These were sacred spaces. These were used for knowledge transmission. This was the method of loci, the associating memory to place. And
the original university.
Exactly. It's exactly what it was. And you only had certain individuals who had proved themselves, who were the keepers of that knowledge. And it was critical that knowledge be contained, and that it be looked after by a few extremely important people, because everyone's life depended on it. Nowadays, well, who cares? If you get something wrong, whatever, doesn't matter. But back then, if you ate the wrong food, you die. If you planted your crops or you got the wrong, you planned something that didn't get the timing right, the conditions right, you're dead.
So in terms of the land that these people 17,000 years ago were talking about, and who were they surrounded by, do we have a sense of surprising discoveries that are still hidden in the mythology, or is it more
yes.
Like, what are you finding?
Oh, I mean, all the time. When you stop looking at mythology as just these interesting little fairy tales and stories that are nice to tell around a campfire for entertainment, which is what a lot of people think they are. When you get away from that idea and you see them for what they actually are, ways of transmitting knowledge, you come to it with a completely different perspective. And also keeping in mind that there are restrictions on the knowledge, who's allowed to know it. The more complex the knowledge is, the fewer people know it, right? Mm. These are your senior elders, your bards, or whomever. So what tends to be the case is the sort of kindergarten, preschool levels of knowledge are the public ones that everybody gets to see and learn about. Well, people very often can see that. I think that's all there is, because they're not privy to the more complex levels of knowledge, which get, really wildly detailed and complicated, But people see all these books of Aboriginal stories. I've got them on my bookshelf behind me. You grab one. Oh, it's nice, like a nice kid story. It is a kid story, but that's not the entirety of it. That's like take any novel and read the little synopsis in the back of the book and think that's it. That one paragraph's the entire book. No, it's not the entire book. That's just a synopsis of what it's about. The kid stories are like that. It's a general synopsis, but as you grow older and you're more steep in the knowledge, the complexity of that gets much, much deeper. There's a lot more information behind it, and it's more difficult to remember. And it's like going to university. It's no different, So these senior elders and these bards and these communities are like your tenured professors, right? They're the ones who have this huge amount of experience and this huge amount of knowledge. And it's critically important that be controlled, or else it gets out of hand and you wind up with all kinds of wild misinformation like we have today. People want to cure cancer by drinking snake oil or something. That's not going to fix things, So understanding that context of mythology and what that means gives you a whole new perspective, and then you can start to unpack that. You can start to see all the science behind it. You can start to it's a lot of other things besides the science. That just happens to be my interest in it. But you can start to see these natural events that are described in it. And there's some stuff, I don't know what I'll learn from it, but there's one story from Western Victoria, for example, that talks about how long ago there were great beasts roaming across the land, and it started describing them like wombats the size of trucks, right, or the size of bulls, which are referring to megafauna, which haven't existed in Victoria in 35, 40,000 years. But it said at the time there were two moons in the sky. There was one moon that occasionally hid itself, and there was a brighter moon that was always there. But that brighter moon disappeared. All the water dried up, all the animals died. There was this huge natural disaster. I'm sitting here thinking, what in the world is that? The smaller moon that occasionally hides itself, that's the moon we're familiar with, right? It goes through phases, it dies away for 3 days before coming back to life, What's this bigger thing? What is that? Is that, and that's when, of course, as an astronomer, my mind goes into, well, what could this be? I don't know. It's speculation. You can have a lot of fun with speculation. Was this describing some kind of nearby supernova? And then the cosmic rays of that caused massive, widespread destruction. There's evidence in ice core samples in Antarctica from about 30 and 60,000 years ago of chemical signatures of potentially huge influx of cosmic rays. Was there some kind of supernova that occurred nearby? I don't know. Your mind can go wild thinking about that. And like I said, it's a lot of fun. We have to be very careful about putting that out there in the world in those terms. But there's a lot, there's so much more than that.
Well, does anybody else mention it? That would be that would be interesting. Do other cultures point at a similar disappearing moon or anything?
I don't know.
Okay.
I have to do research on it. That's why we have jobs, right? It's one of these things where people say, "Oh, science says it has it all figured out." I'm like, "Oh, science doesn't have it figured out. That's why we have jobs. That's why we have scientists. If we had it all figured out, we'd all just be science communicators. We wouldn't be doing actual core research."
This is the thing that's so wild, right? Is that the vast depth of what remains to be discovered and mapped is almost limitless. And I imagine that collecting these stories is a really difficult process of finding the people who keep them, gaining their trust. Are there issues with getting people to tell you the stories or convincing them to enter them into the corpus of scientific research? What's that like?
100%, absolutely, without question. So this becomes the big challenge, right? So if more complex, deeper levels of knowledge become more restricted, how do you have access to that? Should you have access to that? Do you have a right to have access to that? What are you going to do with that information if you do get access to that? Okay, so elders might want to share knowledge with you, and they do. I've had elders share knowledge with me. We're coming to the table together. They're saying, "This is what we're going to share with you," and there's usually some kind of mutual giving back. So we're going to do something for you. What are you going to do for us? Like, this is something we're doing together. So a lot of what I do in areas, especially around major cities where colonization has been so, as one colleague said, it almost complete. Not completely, of course, but this aim was trying to destroy that old knowledge. So a lot of it's been fragmented. The communities say, look, we've got a few elders who know some stories, but we don't have a solid corpus of this knowledge anymore. So I can come in and say, okay, well, I can help you with that. Like, it's never going to be as complete as it was before colonization. But you'd be surprised at the amount of stuff we can pull together from this. The complexity that comes out of something that seems so simple. So I work with the communities, and we go back to the old historical records, and we start to unpack and analyze all that. And we talk to the elders, and they're sharing knowledge, and we're able to bring together this huge body of knowledge and information about that. And of course, other places, they're still passing this knowledge on. It's still quite complicated and detailed. And I've had so many experiences where I've been sitting with elders, they've been sharing knowledge. And when the sort of interview is done, and I'm packing up my gear like we are, we have to set out, cameras and mics and everything. And I've had a couple times where they're like, oh yeah, it reminds me of, and right as I've got everything put away, they sort of deep dive into something. I'm just sitting there going, like, whoa, okay. It's like talking to preschoolers about advanced quantum mechanics, You're just sitting there with my mind blown. And I could tell from them that that's just a little taste. Like, you think you're learning a lot, young fella, but actually what we're giving you is like 1+1. And what I just dropped on you some combinatorics and partial differential equations. Like, you don't know nearly as much as you think you do, not in a nasty way, but just letting me know there's far more to it than that. But the challenge, another big challenge that comes with all of this, ties in with the colonial practices. And it's happened here in Australia, it's happened all around the world, where when you go to a community, say like, okay, you're an academic, you want to be an academic, you want to do your PhD in anthropology, you have a particular pet interest, maybe you want to learn about bush medicine, ethnopharmacology, right? And you go out to a community and you're asking for knowledge, give me knowledge. And yeah, I'll give you something in return, promises, maybe some money, maybe whatever it happens to be. And in the past, communities were, okay, that's fine. We're happy to share some knowledge with you. And what would tend to happen, and it wasn't always done out of malice of the researcher, but what would tend to happen is that researcher would collect that information. They do their ethnography. They live in the community for a year or 2 years. They go back. They write their books. They get their professorship. Everything's happening for them. Community is not getting anything out of that. In many cases, not so much anymore, but back in the day, maybe the communities weren't even consulted about that. And you have white academics arguing over what the elders mean. And the elders saying, well, nobody's asking me. They don't get any of the benefits from that. This person's gone off and made their career. Now they're a tenured professor at whatever university and blah, blah, blah. And they're sold, tons of their copies of their book. And they're going to big conferences around the world to discuss these ideas. And the community is sitting here going, what are we getting out of this? But then what often happens is that knowledge is used against the communities. The government utilizes that knowledge and twists it around in a certain way to, fight land rights or something like that. The communities are always talking about how the knowledge they shared is turned around and used against them. And then companies want to come in and they want to patent and steal the knowledge. The biopiracy comes in and they're going to take this traditional knowledge and they're going to turn it into a pharmaceutical and pump it out there. And the community's not getting the billions of dollars from that or any of the money from that. So what the communities refer that to is, here come the anthros. Here come the anthros. This nonstop procession of usually white, non-Indigenous academics coming in and saying, gimme, gimme, gimme. The community gets nothing. So the community is like, nah, screw off. We're not doing this anymore. Or they'll give you information that's wrong to throw you off. Or if there's something, you ask a question about something that's quite important or sacred or considered secret, oh, we don't know anything about that. Oh, no, I don't know anything about that. No, nobody knows that anymore. That's something, they'll throw you off for good reason. And I've been to the communities by their invitation. And some of the elders have sat down with me to talk, and two things come up. First off, they hear the accent. Like, oh, you American? Yeah. Oh, okay. And funnily enough, in Australia, that's been a benefit. It's not been a detriment, it's been a benefit. And the other one is, oh, are you an anthropologist? No, I'm an astronomer. Like, and one elder said, oh, good. Totally different perspective about how I come to the work.
I mean, it's an understandable pinch point. I think it's been much worse in other societies too. Like I was thinking about the Romans and the Gauls. I believe that the Gallic tradition was maintained entirely by oral conveyance by a priest class, and the Romans looked at it and were just like, hey, if we get rid of those guys, then we can basically clear out the entire superstructure of this society. And they did. They killed off all the priests, I'm not sure the names of those people, but it's a very vulnerable point if you expose yourself for having some lineage that's easily removed or attacked. And of course, the Romans had no use for a different worldview, right? There's no need to have that competition. And so, yeah, you get rid of it. And I'm sure that's happened many, many times over. I mean, obviously in the West where we live, a lot of the indigenous communities were, well, just look at what the Spanish did with their, their shaking their crucifixes at people while they burned them at the stake or whatever the hell they were doing. It's a real vulnerability, I suppose, to be people who have a different way of looking at things. And one question would be how isolated are these groups? Like, you have to forgive me. I know next to nothing about the Australian Indigenous people, but are there uncontacted tribes out there, or are there essentially isolated tribes, or are these people, how long have they really been interacting regularly with Westerners?
Oh, there's a few interesting points there. So one was a very common colonial idea that there are different Aboriginal groups and they're all isolated and stay with each other, and that's it. There's very little connection between them. I mean, the ones that are adjacent, obviously, will share stuff, but that was it. And what you find with the communities is there are trade networks that go from coast to coast, which, trade routes we'll call song lines. It's a literal mapping of the country in song that you would recite as you travel, which is also mapped out in the stars, right? But it's all mapped out in the country. And it says method of loci method. It's a method of loci technique.
Okay, yeah, sorry, you've said that loci several times. I want to make sure that we define it for people.
Okay, method of loci is actually a Greek term. It's associating memory to place. And place can be a lot of things. It can be the physical landscape around you, it can be the stars, it could be an object. And a lot of cultures utilize this with what we think of as art. Art is mnemonic. Art is memory. Designs, textures, colors, we can associate memory to those. And we do so very well. And there can be handheld devices. And the Lula people in Africa refer to them as lukasa. A lot of Aboriginal communities might have the chiringas. There'll be different things that are carved or have something put on them or whatever. And it's a way of associating memory to place. And it's very powerful. If you want to learn a bit about that, there's a series of books written by Lynn Kelly, who is a scholar here in Australia, outside Melbourne. She wrote The Memory Code. She wrote Memory Craft, which are about memory techniques. Memory Code is all about archaeology and memory and how those the secret sites like Stonehenge and Newgrange and all those places tie into memory palaces. And she just published a book last week here, which I think comes out in a few months in the US, called The Knowledge Gene. It's exactly what we're talking about here. So yeah, there's so much there that's exciting to talk about. We can get into those discussions, but
the one that I've heard about over here, at least in the Western Hemisphere, is the kipa from the indigenous Peruvians. They have these knot tying devices, and
exactly.
Like nobody can really figure them out, but they know they're important somehow. And it sounds like there were devices similar.
Yeah, exactly right. So, there's lots of ways of being able to encode that knowledge into place. So Aboriginal communities, would encode the entire landscape with knowledge and information. So you find that the communities, any random area, one person in the community probably spoke multiple languages, right? So there's lots of connection between the communities all across Australia, north, south, east, west. There were connection to other communities outside of Australia, into New Guinea, into Indonesia, potentially even into the South Pacific. There were all these discussions about that. So there was all these connections and trade networks and things that were happening that colonists didn't recognize. you know. But also the idea, are there, well, you know, what you think of as uncontacted tribes as far as Westerners? Well, it was only back in the 1970s, I think even actually the 80s. People fact check me on this. I'm just going off the cuff, off my memory.
Ballpark.
The Pintupi Five, I believe, is what they were referred to in, you know, the media. They were a group of Aboriginal people, Pintupi language area out in the central western desert region, who had never interacted with Europeans before, white people ever. They sort of came in out of the desert, is how it was always described. A very strange colonial way of putting it. But yeah, that was sort of the uncontacted. It was only a handful of people. You know, it was only 5 people. Might have been a couple more, but you know, it's not quite here like it is with the Amazon or Siberia or other places where there's literally people that have had little or absolutely no contact with the outside world. But in Australia, you do have a lot of communities where the knowledge is still strong, the traditions are still strong, where you're going to have these amazing repositories of knowledge that have been passed down for thousands of years, potentially over 10,000 years. So the question that I have to grapple with is, you know, there's a part of me that's excited and wants to learn about that kind of stuff, but it's also, I don't know, maybe it's not just a modern Western thing, but like the idea that I should have access to that knowledge because all knowledge is important, so I should have access to it. Well, no, that doesn't necessarily mean that I should have access to it. I want to learn about that, of course, but it's those communities, their decision whether they're going to share that knowledge with me. So some elders and communities want to share knowledge, some don't. Some have said that, you know, we're losing our languages, elders are dying. If we don't share this knowledge with the world, we're going to lose it forever, that we should. And other elders are saying, no, we developed this, it's ours. If we don't want it, you know, pillaged and destroyed or maligned or twisted into something different, we have to keep that. And if we want to die with that, we'll die with that. That's going to be an individual thing, sometimes even a community agreed thing. There's knowledge out there that is powerful. There's knowledge out there that's going to be describing stuff beyond any of our dreams. That doesn't mean we're always going to learn about it. We're always going to know it. But one little element of that, just to tie in how this links today, there are a lot of major initiatives in astrophysics right now that are trying to understand different stuff happening in the universe. There's a particular field called transient astronomy. We're looking at transient events. These are gamma ray bursts and supernovas and these high energy, short time period things that happen, right? And supernova being one of the easy ones to understand. So the question then becomes, you know, are there records of these kinds of things in these old world traditions, in these mythologies, that could describe them? Is there information in them that could help us learn more about something, like in terms of modern astrophysics? And the answer is yes. And this is where it gets really, really cool. So we can think about that in terms of both oral tradition and written records. So to use a written record example, there were a group of scientists who in the last 15 years wrote a series of papers looking at ancient Egyptian records. Ancient Egyptian knowledge of astronomy often had a heavy astrological purpose to it, right? There'd be a king or a pharaoh, whoever, you know, who wants to know how things work because to them, things happening in the cosmos have personal meaning, you know, especially if you're a person in power. An eclipse might be a powerful sign, positive or negative, you know, all kinds of transient things like that would happen. So you had your court astronomers who had to figure out how these things worked because you wanted to know how to interpret it. So what they're doing, you could think of as science, right? They're figuring out celestial mechanics. How are these things working? How can I predict it? The application of that becomes more astrological. The pharaoh decides this is a good omen for me, so I'm going to attack this person or whatever it happens to be. You know, lots of that throughout history.
Well, there's a lot of power in being able to predict things too, by the way. I mean, if you can.
There is a lot of power in being able to predict it. Exactly. And a lot of ancient cultures were battling with each other, you know, on who had a more accurate ability to predict, especially eclipses. That was a big one. But what they were looking at was these old ancient Egyptian records that were talking about these sort of astrological calendars, and they noticed that a certain star, the star Algol, right? Algol was seen as the eye of Medusa, right? Which you can see in oh god, I'm horrible if I'm an astronomy professor and get this wrong. I think it's Perseus. He's holding the head of Medusa in his hand. Algol was seen as her eye winking, right? And lots of cultures talk about this eye being variable, changing at its will. And as it turns out, it's a binary star system, right? So it's a binary system with a larger star and a smaller star. And when they eclipse, because they happen to be in the same line of sight as us, when they eclipse, the little star moves in front of the big star. It blocks some of the big star's light out. It dips in brightness a little bit. Over the course of several hours, it will drop in brightness. And this recurs every 3 days. A little bit less than 3 days, but roughly 3 days, it goes to this. And there's a primary and a secondary transit, right? So when it moves in front of the big star, that's a primary transit. It does a deep dip. And when it moves behind it, there's a little bit of a dip. The little thing you don't really notice. It's too subtle to notice with the human eye. But when the little star goes in front of the big one, it's blocking a big chunk of that light out. It's a big dip, right? So they had worked out this star does this. They'd worked out its periodicity, right? There's two things that were important about that. One, even going back to what Aristotle said, the cosmos are unchanging and invariable. Well, we knew that ancient cultures recognized the cosmos were not invariable. They did, in fact, change. And that ancient cultures recognize variable stars. So stars whose brightness changes over time, which could be caused by eclipsing binaries, could be caused by the pulsating of the star like Antares or Betelgeuse, could be caused by some other effect. Those were the two general.
I just saw that Betelgeuse is back in the binary camp again, maybe.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, maybe a trinary. I don't know. That's the newest theory, because they were going on and on about how it was going to blow up any day now for several years now, and yeah, the latest headline I saw. Anyways,
great dimming, and there was the great brightening.
Yeah.
So what was cool about that? Not only so there's the history of astronomy side, which that actually ancient Egyptians recorded variable stars. That's amazing, right? But the cool thing about this is the records have been kept in such detail for so long, they were able to analyze it well enough to figure out the exact periodicity of that transit. And when they found out is that a couple thousand years ago, when the ancient Egyptians were recording this, that they were faster. That time period was shorter, which meant the stars were closer together. They were orbiting faster. And the models of what astronomers are looking at with these stars are showing that they're actually moving apart. But looking back at these ancient records from the Egyptians having an astrological application to it, they were able to show that these two stars were actually close together. They are moving apart. They can see over that time period how much they're moving apart. You're able to constrain astrophysical models of these stars and their dynamics based on ancient Egyptian astrological records. Now, that's what I love about this stuff.
It seems to me that there is like two types of storytelling about the world. One of which is, let's say, like vibes first, and the other is it's basically data collection, right? And one of them seems to be the approach that is favored by empires in order to coalesce power and establish themselves and to grow massive, because like Shiloh was saying, like you can do a lot with prediction. And when you have priests that are watching the stars and are able to say with great certainty that an eclipse is coming or that there's going to be some celestial event, and then the pharaoh can stand at the top of the pyramid and announce that this is coming, and then it's just this massive just magic trick. It's very, very effective at convincing people to do things that they might not otherwise do, because then on top of that you have a story that, the gods are telling you something through this event. And then it feels like there's other cultures that are just more focused on the experiential storytelling aspect of it, and the way that they manifest their social structures is very, very different from the massive empires. Do you see that that's the case, or is that just intuition?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. There's lots of different ways that astronomy is applied and used. But depending if you've got this, you have big, giant society, civilization, whatever you want to call it, yeah, versus smaller communities. It's absolutely like that. And a great example of exactly what you were talking about and the power of prediction and the way that's been maligned and weaponized is eclipse prediction. Are you familiar with the story of Columbus? So when Columbus came to what now I think Haiti, that there was this period of time where he was running out of supplies and his crew was about to mutiny, and he was faced with this horrible situation, and the indigenous people he was there who were supplying them with food and resources and stuff were kind of like, you guys are seriously overstaying your welcome. You're starting to piss us off. Like, we're done. And he's just like, oh shit, what am I going to do now? So he had an almanac, and he looked in his almanac and realized that there was going to be an eclipse coming up soon. So he told the people that, his God was very displeased with them and that they need to continue supplying him and his men, his crew, with resources and food and stuff. Or if they didn't do that, then he was going to blot out the sun. Right. I forget if it was a lunar eclipse or solar eclipse, whatever. It didn't matter. He was going to blot out, I think it was a solar eclipse. He's going to blot out the sun, and knowing from the almanac what day it was going to happen, what time it was going to happen, he utilized this and tried, it was this whole idea of getting the natives to bend to his will, at which point he goes into his chambers in his ship to consult with his God. And while he's in there, the sun starts going into eclipse. And of course, everybody's freaking out, and he comes back out. They're like, yes, we'll give you whatever you want to make the sun come back. He utilized that trickery from the power of eclipse prediction. But the funny thing is that has been used as a trope in literature and cinema numerous times since really about the late 1800s. Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain utilized it. The Adventures of Tintin utilized it. There was all kinds of films and things which utilized this thing of, it was used as this sort of a colonial tool of feelings of intellectual superiority. We can predict an eclipse of the sun or the moon, and we're going to utilize this against these so-called primitive people and make them bend to our will, and you see all this kind of rubbish happening. And the irony of all of that is that ancient cultures had the ability to predict eclipses. The Maya had the ability to predict eclipses. Torres Strait Islanders that I work for up in the Torres Strait, they have a whole ceremony tied around an eclipse. They have whole headdresses and dances, a whole thing that only happens during an eclipse. And that lunar eclipse, it's a lunar eclipse ceremony. That is the final level of initiation for the Zugaba Mabai, who are the traditional astronomers, who have to forecast that, right? Only culture, that's been confirmed, or whatever you want to call it, in the annals of the history of science, an oral-based culture who had predicted an eclipse. Other cultures, the Maya, the Sumerians, they did it through writing, supposedly, but they did it through orality. But there was this really funny story that was published, I don't remember how long ago it was, where there was some conquistador with the Maya, and he was going to come in and try to utilize this trick, and the people killed him. And said, we already knew it was coming. We already had the capacity to predict it. They flipped the narrative around.
How does a culture that is oral exclusively store the knowledge necessary to compute the arrival of an eclipse?
Oh, this is a good one. Couple things that we have to think about. First off, orality doesn't mean that only knowledge is passed on through spoken stories. Things can be passed on physically. So those knotted beads, they may look like knotted beads to the outsider, but the people who created those, you can encode all kinds of information. You can encode numbers. You can encode mathematics into that. And I had a huge fight with a couple of amateur astronomers over this. Oh, this is the fun part of my job. So the islanders have had this sacred cob card, this sacred secret dance, this ceremony tied in to the lunar eclipse. They've had this long before colonization, right? This wasn't something that's a modern invention, and so what if it was, but it's not, right? And they talk about, so in that culture, they talk about the Zugabal Mabaig. The Zugabal Mabaig, Zugabals refer to the Zogoli, spiritual people who were, the origin story was a story of Tagai. So Tagai was this fierce warrior. He was an expert hunter, an expert fisher, spiritual man, leader. His brother, some communities say his friend, his brother, Kareg, was his sort of first mate, and he commanded a crew of 12 men called the Zugabals. So it's Tagai, Kareg, and the 12 men. And the story goes that they were going on this huge fishing expedition, and they went out onto the reefs. They were going to be out there for quite some time, and they couldn't find any fish. So they pull up by one of the reefs, and Tagai got out and was able to walk across parts of the reef to see if they could find a better fishing spot. Well, it was really hot, and the other men, the Zugabals, were growing tired. They began consuming the rations, drinking the water, and starting to eat the food. And before long, they consumed everything for the entire trip. We've all been on road trips. It's happened to us. We know how it goes, right? And when Kareg had told the men, like, you guys need to knock this off because this is going to end badly, and they didn't listen to him. When Tagai came back, he went to get into the canoe, and when he did, he heard the coconut shells, which were supposed to be full of water, rattling. They're not supposed to rattle if they're full, right? And he's basically like, what the hell happened? And Kareg told him, and he threw into a fit of rage, and he killed the 12 crew. He bound them up into two different groups. One he cast in, he speared all the way through them, and the other ones he tied up and they drowned. Different stories in different islands tell you different things about it. But point being is those two groups of 6 men, which because they were spiritual men, they were Zogoli, they couldn't die. So they all ascended up into the sky. One group, Seg, became the stars of the belt and scabbard of Orion, and Usium became the stars in the Pleiades. Right? So it's Usium and Seg. Some islands, Usium and Utamal. Those became those two groups of stars. Now Tagai and Kareg, so upset with them, he put himself on the opposite side of the sky, where he's standing there holding a giant spear. His left hand is the Southern Cross. His right hand is the western constellation of Corvus the Crow. The stars of Lupus and Centaurus trace out his entire body, and he's standing in his canoe, which are the stars of Scorpius. And his first mate, or his brother, Kareg, is the red star Antares, right? So and they're opposite sides of the sky from each other. As these stars are rising and setting throughout the year at dusk and dawn, it tells you changing seasons and when to plant and when to hunt and when the dugong are migrating and when the turtles are breeding, all this kind of stuff. Which itself is interesting because Orion, Scorpius, something happened to them, opposite sides of the sky, keep them away from each other, goes back to the Greek and Roman traditions, right? Where Orion and Scorpius got into a fight, and the gods put them on opposite sides of the sky to keep them away from each other. Interesting parallels there. That's a whole other conversation.
No, that's one I really want to get to, by the way, is conservation across cultures.
We'll get into that.
Okay.
Oh, we're doing some big stuff here on that, which is awesome.
We're not going to let you go without doing that.
We got time. So going back to that story. So the Zugabals became stars and constellations, and there's lots of them in the sky, of course. So that's the term for that. So Zugabal Mabaig means man or person. And what the elders say is that in traditional times, when a person was about early to mid-teens, early teens, 14, 15, a few select individuals would be selected for training, and they would be taken from their families and placed in the quad, the KWOD quad, which was a very secretive place of higher learning. Right. It was also sort of like a university cum parliament house, right? But it was a very secret, sacred place where they would go through, and the elder told me, the 7 years of intense instruction initially to learn the art of astronomy. That's where you were trained in that, right? 7 years in the Australian system, 3 years of undergraduate, 2 years of master's, another 3 years of PhD. It's about 6, 7, 8 years. It's kind of the same thing, right? But when you graduated, you had a very broad knowledge of astronomy, of the stars, and how to read them, what they were telling you. But you had ownership. There were certain stars you looked out for, and those are the ones that you had specialized knowledge about, which is just like going through university. You get a broad knowledge of astrophysics, but as you go into grad school, you get a focused area, right? But there were multiple levels of initiation as you would grow older. And fewer people would reach those highest levels of initiation. Well, the final level of initiation was to take the head of an enemy, right? And the elders are very open about this. In the Torres Strait, Papua New Guinea area, headhunting was a common practice, right? And it was believed you took the head of an enemy, you absorbed their power, which you see a lot of cultures. The Celtic cultures did that. You saw the Highlander take the head, sort of thing. The old Celtic warriors would tie the head around their waist. It was absorbing their ki, their power, their energy. So this was also meant to test the physical bravery. Like, being that kind of person wasn't just an intellectual thing, it was also a physical one. So these raids would only occur after these eclipses. So you had to predict when this eclipse was going to occur. And you would have the community come in, the men would prepare for war, the women would take the children, and they would go off and find security and safety. But how they predicted where they were going to go almost seems a bit astrological, right? They would know when this lunar eclipse was going to happen, and when the moon went into eclipse, like, when the moon started going dark, you'll see like a little black come up. It gets completely taken over, turns blood red, and then goes back. They would start performing this dance with the special dhar, the special headdress, and they begin reciting the names of all the different islands in the region. And when the moon went out of eclipse, the name they were on, that's where they believed the raiders were coming from. So you've got this whole thing tied into eclipses and being able to predict lunar eclipses. Well, how do you do that? Well, there's 3 critical pieces of information you need to know. 2 of them are fairly easy. The third one's not so easy. One of them is that if you're going to have a lunar eclipse, it has to be during a full moon. Okay. Just like a solar eclipse is during a new moon. Lunar eclipse during a full moon. That's the easy one. Second one is you need to know something about eclipse seasons. And this is where the moon crosses, the particular node around the Earth, where you're gonna have this alignment of syzygy, where the Earth, Moon, and Sun are going to be lined up enough where you're going to be able to have this kind of eclipse. And this happens every 6 months or so, right? But it shifts because the lunar calendar and the solar calendar don't sync up. You've got to create a lunisolar calendar, which is what we have, and you have leap years and days and weird odd numbered months and stuff. So you had to figure that part out. But then you also had to understand the Saros cycle, that 18.01 something year cycle, when a configuration between the Earth, Moon, and the Sun, that particular syzygy would come back to the exact same alignment again, right? So you had to understand that. That's tricky. But as it turns out, it's exactly 223 synodic months, 223 lunar months. It's going to come back around to the same configuration, almost, plus 8 hours. Plus 8 hours.
So it's just a matter of keeping time then, and I guess really, yeah.
Well, okay, so
and there's multiple Saros cycles that can overlap, so you've got to be able to understand how all that works.
And in some level, it seems also to be a readout of a culture that has settled in a place. Because it always strikes me that these sorts of record keepings can only really begin when you have stopped migrating. Because if you're constantly migrating and you're trying to track like where the sun is rising and setting, your landscape is changing. And the way that I've always imagined it is that you have either a stick that you've placed, and then over the course of a year you continue to add stuff to it so you can see how the time is passing. And if you're moving all of the time, then it's hard to take that with you. But you seem to, your face suggests that that's perhaps not the case.
Well, no, I mean, that is true. That is true. In Australia, there was this idea for a long time that cultures were very nomadic, and that the implication is just kind of wandering around aimlessly. It's like, no, they have a particular boundary of country, and they knew that different resources within their country were seasonal. So this is the best place to be this time of the year for these reasons. This is the best place to be for these reasons. And they would go and move around those different areas, understanding how it all linked together and why you're going in there. Now, some places, like, where the major cities are, you'd have lots of different communities, and they were a little bit more sedentary. Where if you're out in the Western desert, you got very few resources. You do have to move around a lot, so there is a lot of huge movement around the desert regions. You can't just stay in one spot all the year, But you had to be able to understand how those things all work together. But you got all that knowledge encoded in the stars, which is also reflected in the landscape. So there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with that. But also the way in which you can tie knowledge to the memory of things you're talking about is quite an interesting thing. So you would have people who specialized in star knowledge, astronomers, if you want to call them that. And they would talk about how there'd be certain old men who would sit in these small circles up on the hilltops, and they'd be watching the sun, they'd be watching the moon, they'd be watching the stars. They would have markers, stones they would use as markers to be able to tell, for example, from solstice to solstice, or the phases of the moon, where the moon was going to be, or when stars were going to rise, even the planets. The motions of the planets were understood quite well, which are incredibly complex. You get the whole synodic motion of Venus, which is a wild one. The ceremony is tied around that 584-day synodic period. But the interesting thing was people recognized that the sky wasn't the same everywhere, right? They recognized that point in the sky that doesn't move, that south celestial pole, which there's no bright stars there, but you can kind of tell that part of the sky doesn't really move much. These stars move very slowly, where stars further away move very quickly over the course of a night. But if you travel long distances north-south, that changes its angle in the sky, right? So if you're looking at the south celestial pole, so let's go to the northern hemisphere. You look at Polaris. If Polaris is at the north celestial pole, there's only one place on the Earth that's going to be at zenith, directly overhead. That's the North Pole. As you start moving towards the equator, it's going to get lower and lower and lower until you're standing on the equator. That star is going to be in the horizon. What that means is the altitude, the angle from the horizon up to where that star is, the altitude of that star in the sky is your latitude, right? So cultures realize that, if you're really high up, let's say you're in Alaska, Polaris is high in the sky. Not straight overhead, but it's high in the sky. You start moving down Canada, gets lower. You start getting down to the continent of the US, gets lower. You start getting down to, keeps getting lower and lower until you get to the equator. Once you pass over the equator, it disappears. New stars start coming in that you didn't see before. Now, if you're Polynesian in the Pacific, going from Hawaii to Aotearoa, you're going to notice that, right? And Aboriginal cultures notice this. You notice that the spread of the solstices, when it reaches this point to this point, that angle along the horizon, that azimuthal angle, as you're closer to the equator, it's pulled in a little bit. And as you start going south, it widens up until you get to a certain point, get to the Antarctic Circle, it completely blows out. But people recognize all of these subtle changes, like, all these reasons we know the Earth is round, right? Ancient cultures figured this stuff out thousands of years ago, right? This isn't some modern thing. But the cultures had to understand the sky is dynamic and changing, and that your location on the land depends on a few factors of how the sky is going to look. Or I should say, how the sky is going to look depends on your location on the Earth. So cultures understood this, and you had to understand that to be able to work out all these detailed ceremonies tied to certain types of astronomical phenomena. So what that tells us is these cultures knew a hell of a lot more about astronomy than they're ever given credit for.
I wonder, would you mind if we took a little break to use the bathroom really quick? I've been drinking too much water.
Let's do that.
Hey guys, a really quick interruption before the sun goes away completely and I'm plunged into darkness. If you enjoy the podcast and you like what we do, come over to patreon.com/demystifysci. We would love to see you at our weekly patron chats, and we would love to keep this podcast free of sponsors, advertisers, and anything else that interferes with the awesome conversations that we would have otherwise. So we'll see you there at patreon.com/demystifysci. You guys are...
You're in Oregon right now.
We're actually down in San Francisco right now, but otherwise
nice.
Normally in Oregon.
We were in Hawaii yesterday, though, so we're freezing.
Oh, yeah, it's a bit of a juxtaposition there, is it? Whereabouts in Hawaii were you?
We were in Maui. Yeah.
I mean, anywhere is nice, right? But
it was extremely chill. We're adjusting to reality again.
I was stunned by the discovery that our current understanding is that the Hawaiian Islands didn't get peopled until 1200 AD.
Yeah, very recently.
But the Pacific Islanders had myths of the islands being full of little people when they arrived. And I wonder if there's actually anything significant about that.
Not to mention the disappearing island, like the sea level changes across the last 10,000 years. And I don't know. Seems like a lot of missing data.
Some interesting stuff there. I mean, it's funny. I was just reading about Homo floresiensis last night. I mean, it's well known here, the the Hobbit, early hominids, because about a month ago there was some new excavations that showed new information about them, that they go back much further than was thought. It was thought they might have disappeared as recently as 12,000 years ago, but it turns out that what they based it on was pretty shoddy. It goes back about 50,000 years. But yeah, Polynesia is an interesting one because the Proto-Polynesian, the earliest Polynesian came from Taiwan, and then they moved down across northern Indonesia, past the Philippines, into northern Indonesia, and they branched off. One group went down to Madagascar. Right, so the Polynesians and the Madagascar people are same origins, right?
That's a big ocean in between.
Right, exactly. And then the people went across through the northern part of New Guinea, and it was one of those situations where there was definitely some, people marrying across those cultures, and then went off to the inner part of the Pacific Islands, in Samoa and Tonga. We're there for a couple thousand years. And it was only this expansion out to Rapa Nui, to Aotearoa, to Hawaii, to all these other places, not even 1,000 years ago. That was the whole thing about, Moana, when they did that Disney film, they showed a lot of that. So I used to be married to a woman who was Maori. And she was an astronomer as well. And we went to our honeymoon on Rapa Nui, which is the largest of the Cook Islands, right? And we were there, we were vaguely aware that was a special place for that, because that is where the 7, or was it 9? I think the 7 Vaka, the 7 canoes, went out to Aotearoa from there. So Polynesian culture has kind of gone out through the middle part of that, and then expanded outward, out up north to Hawaii, down to Rapa Nui, and then out to Aotearoa. And when we were there, there's this place on the island where there's a stone circle, and those stones represent the 7 canoes. And we were there, she was able to identify the canoe, the Vaka, the stone that represented that Vaka that her ancestors came from. So we were able to do that, which is really this, really pretty cool thing to be able to do. But yeah, there's lots of stories about, islands and places being peopled before others arise. And this becomes one of those things where this is where the interesting part of mythology comes in, right? Because when people move from one place to the other by choice or by force, in some cases, you see it here in Australia, stories that were placed in the landscape in this region were then adopted to the new area. So you can see in places where communities were taken from their homes in the Kimberley up in the northwest of Western Australia and brought down to New South Wales, across the entire continent. When the people arrived, they took all those stories and they coded it into the landscape. This is where this happened, this is where that happened, and everything else. They encoded that localized knowledge in. And of course, you're thinking about, but it's that over there where it happened, up in Western Australia. How can that be here? Well, when people move, they put that new knowledge in. So I don't know, some of those stories may go back to when the humans first, modern, it's called anatomical humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, started migrating out of Africa. The world was already covered in other hominids. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo habilis, they were already all over the world, before humans came out. So humans were interacting with these other communities, and then with Neanderthals and Denisovans breeding with them, which is why most of us who are not sub-Saharan African have a couple percent of Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA. So they started, they would go across these islands. There would be these tiny humans like Homo florensis, and it's believed it could have been other, hobbit-sized people on other islands and stuff, which that's a whole different kettle of fish. That's always made me wonder. Humans have lived alongside other hominids, some of them being hairy and some of them being quite big, throughout, going back hundreds of thousands of years, made me kind of wonder, and this is something I should be careful about even saying in public, but of all these ideas about the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the hairy man in the bush, is somehow the memory of the experience we actually had with those kinds of other hominids way back, that somehow, deep inside almost the reptilian part of our brain. I'm sure neuroscientists would knock me down on that, but it's made me wonder. I don't think there are any of those creatures that exist today, of course, but if that is somehow one of those pieces of vestigial knowledge or memory that's lasted for that long. Anyway, it's a tough
and like not to necessarily like go full Graham Hancock on this, but there's the archaeology on the Hawaiian Islands is pretty spotty, and I don't think it's anyone's fault. It's just that it hasn't been given the funding or attention that it deserves. And so when you look at how many digs there have been, there's just not that. And honestly, even if you just look at all of our archaeological records, it's so spotty, right? We have sometimes hundreds of thousands of years missing in the record here and there in different regions, right? And so, who knows what kind of things will be discovered in the future that will fill in some of the gaps for us. It's hard to say at this point. But I just find it, I find it really hard.
Archaeologists, right?
Yeah, and a lot of it's underwater too. And it's like I always make the point of the Venn diagram between really athletic divers and really nerdy archaeologists is pretty narrow. And so if just given what we know about sea level changes, there's a lot of cool stuff that's underwater that we're just not going to find for a while. So
it's kind of funny you mentioned that, because in about, what day is it now? We're almost halfway through June. Gee.
Oh
no! Welcome to September.
Yeah. In about 2.5 weeks, I'm flying to Europe to spend a month in Brest, in Brittany, at the Institute for Marine Studies, to focus on geomythology of sea level rise.
Cool.
Of places that are now underwater that used to not be underwater. Right. Which, of course, in Australia, there's lots of that, and there is all over the world. So I'm actually spending a whole month next month doing that exact thing over there, and linking that with some of the stuff that we're doing in Australia. Look, there's a lot of cool shit that needs to be studied. There's huge gaps in our knowledge, but we don't have every archaeologist in the world, which has been billions of dollars of funding at our disposal to be able to go do whatever it is we wanted. And somebody made a joke about this, one of these, academic forums, where now as an academic, I can totally go back and look at Jurassic Park, where they totally followed this guy, this old rich man, to some island in the Pacific somewhere to see what he's got, because he promised 3 years of funding. I'm like, hell yeah, I would go and check it out too, So yeah, there's huge gaps in our knowledge, because maybe there's natural events that have occurred that are just going to cause those gaps in knowledge. There's going to be the amount of time and capacity we have to go check things out, stuff that gets destroyed and put under a parking lot, that we wouldn't even know about otherwise. And the idea that science has it all figured out, as we've discussed before, is ridiculous. We don't. That's why we're here. That's why we have jobs. That doesn't mean you can just start filling in the gaps with aliens and God and, some ancient advanced civilization. We didn't need an ancient advanced civilization. We need to acknowledge that ancient cultures were a lot smaller than we think they are. And there was no single advanced culture that somehow survived an ancient apocalypse and then went around the world telling everybody, well, if these survived, then what? None of that makes any sense to me. Which is funny, because I spent a year in Germany at the Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies studying that exact same thing.
Interesting. And you came away from that just convinced that there couldn't have been anyone?
It's not that there couldn't have been anyone. It's that there's no need for that. I mean, there's no evidence that there was a highly advanced civilization. There's lots of evidence that ancient civilizations were a hell of a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, and so in that topic, I wonder, when you're looking at myths, how you know the most fruitful pieces to pull on. Because a myth has a lot of different features.
You don't. That's part of it. There have been stories that I've gone through and read, and of course, stories that you read, in most cases, they're published, right? They've been edited. They're translated into English first off. They're edited. They're usually the kindergarten, preschool version of the story. you got to consider all of that. You got to consider, well, how much poetic license did the editor or whoever it was who wasn't the original storyteller put in this? And there are little bits of poetic license. When you're like me and you're unpacking every single word has some kind of significance and meaning to that could be telling you something interesting. How much of that is what the storyteller was saying? And how much of that is, we need to fluff up the story a bit to make it sound nice or whatever, or we're going to dull things down because a lot of those stories had some pretty wild stuff in them. There's one story, I forget where the community's from. I could look it up, where two brothers who were led to the moon, it was a star story. Basically, two brothers were out in the bush, and then while the younger brother fell asleep, the older one cut his genitals off and made him his wife. So put that in your primary school story and see how well that's going to go off.
Do you get a sense for do you get a sense for how literally these knowledge keepers take these stories, or do you think that they're more focused on the greater metaphorical story? And the reason I ask is because there's, like, in the modern world, like at least the most popular mythology is probably Christianity, like out here in the West, and there's a really interesting divide between the fundamentalist, literalist Christians and the people who are like, no, this is a really useful story of how to live your life, and what will happen if you don't, and so on and so forth. Is there a diversity of interpretive scales in the indigenous communities as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I grew up in rural mid-Missouri with one half of my family being Assembly of God, the other half being Lutheran, exactly exemplifying that crazy sort of divide you would have in those kinds of areas. So these old traditions can have multiple functions. They can have multiple meanings. One thing that I got frustrated with learning about the literature by anthropologists is many anthropologists would go to communities and they would write down star knowledge, but they only wrote down the star knowledge that everybody agreed on, and they would discard everything else. I'm like, no, what are you doing? There's not necessarily a unified, agreed upon origin story that everybody has to get, and if you don't get it right, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be burned at the stake. You're going to be chastised in the community. You'll have lots of marriages from people from different communities. My father's Wiradjuri, my mother's Baraka, completely different areas. They bring their stories in because a story is telling you something important. And whether it's meant to be taken literally or figuratively or symbolically, all of the above depends on the context of it. But there's what you really lack with these indigenous knowledge systems that's different from organized religion is the idea of dogma, right? They're not dogmatic. They're not like, this is how it is, and if you get it wrong, we're going to burn you at the stake or something. If the information contained within that is faulty, that can have a real world impact. So there are places where, in certain times of the year, there's very few food sources. So they've started eating this particular kind of tuber, this yam. But this tuber is poisonous if you don't prepare it in a very special way. It takes 3 or 4 days sometimes to soak it and prepare it, and then it's fine. But if you don't do that right, you're dead, right? So if you screw that information up somehow, that can have devastating results. And, I mean, that's just one general sort of example of that, but you've got stuff like that that applies all around the world.
Was there a star story associated with that tuber? Was that actually encoded in a myth? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
That's wild.
So there is traditions up in Tiwi country. So the Tiwi Islands are these 2 islands north of Darwin, the very northern tip of Australia. And they've got a special ceremony they call the Kulama ceremony. And the Kulama relates to an ancestral figure who's the moon. And this ceremony tends to take place towards the end of the monsoon season, which is around April. There's a lot of these different types of ceremonies that occur around April, which is the monsoon starts to end in April, and then you get the dry season that comes in May. And they say that around that time, you're going to see a lot of lunar halos, rings around the moon, that are very frequent at that time of the year. And there's this whole big ceremony they do There's an initiation ceremony. There's a harvesting ceremony. The things you planted at the beginning of the wet season, you can now harvest, and there's big celebrations across the region. And that when they have the ceremonial grounds with these giant circles that represent the moon men, and they represent those halos. But that also ties in with the preparation of this special tuber. Well, this tuber happens to take 3 days to process, right? Which for a lot of cultures, that 3 days is very significant because that 3 days is the 3 days of rejuvenation. Usually the moon figure dies for 3 days, goes to the underworld, that comes back again. So we're talking about mythology. Christian mythology with astronomy is wild, you know. And I haven't seen a lot written about this. I'm sure people have discussed it. You know, I was talking to some of my undergraduate students just a couple of weeks ago in one of the cultural astronomy courses I teach, Archaeoastronomy. I was saying, okay, well, let's look at this idea of myth and the cosmos. You know, what are the 3 brightest objects in the sky?
Sun, Moon, and Venus?
I think Antares.
Exactly.
Oh, Venus. Right. Okay.
Yeah, Sun, Moon, and Venus, right? Excluding some transient supernova event or something like that. You know, normally it's those 3, right? And so God is always seen as the light, right? God is the son of God. You know, the son of the initial offspring of the sun is always the moon, right? Almost always the moon. Slightly lesser light, but you know, goes through this period of birth, becoming all powerful, waning away. Something happens, they die, they go to the underworld for 3 days before coming back to life, right? So Jesus is the Son of God is a very common motif. Jesus, the day he's executed, there's an eclipse that happens. The moon goes black, right? That, of course, is when he's furthest away from the sun. He's opposite side of the sky from the sun. My God, why have you forsaken me? You know, it's just you can unpack the astronomy behind that. It's quite wild. But of course, let's look at Venus. Well, who's Venus? That's the easy one. Who's Venus?
Lucifer?
Lucifer, the morning star. That's what his name meant. And what is special about Venus? How is it always described by different cultures? What's the one characteristic about Venus that everybody relates to?
The visit to the underworld?
No, that's well, but that comes in. It's beautiful.
Mm.
The goddess of beauty, right? And how was Lucifer described? Extremely beautiful, right? So what is Venus constantly trying to do? It's constantly trying to ascend and escape away from the sun. And the sun's down here that's trying to go up on its own. It's trying to get up and ascend and get away, but can't quite make it. Gets pulled back down, eventually comes back down to the underworld, and then disappears into hell or the underworld, what are you going to call it, for long periods of time before coming back again in the evening. First he was in the morning, then he's in the evening. He's trying to ascend, trying to be beautiful, trying to get bigger and bigger, brighter and brighter as it gets further up in the sky, but gets pulled back down again, and then comes back down to hell again. And it's this constant cycle of trying to ascend and escape the gravitational clutches of God, to be beautiful in his own right before he gets pulled back down to the underworld again. So you see these kinds of motifs repeat themselves over and over and over throughout different cultures. And you're reading this, and you're like, my God, this sounds like Christianity. And like, there's a reason for that. A lot of these global religions use the cosmos to tell their stories, to relate to them. So when you look at the sun, moon, and Venus, and you look at God, Jesus, and Lucifer, I mean, of course, it makes perfect sense. You begin unpacking it and looking at it in that particular way. Which, of course, up in our land, they've got a whole ceremony called the Banambir, which is tied to this cycle. And the Banambir cycle is Venus as a morning star, and it's this ancestral woman who goes up into the sky, and as she rises, she begins naming all the land and the plants and the animals and everything. But she's afraid of floating off. So her sisters tie a white rope to her to keep her pulled down so she doesn't float away. So she goes up and then back down again, right? And the people have this special ceremony that they have when Venus reappears as a morning star. So the way it happens, when you look at the celestial dynamics of these two bodies, Venus and the Earth and the Sun, Venus appears as a morning star for 263 days. They call that an apparition. It's a period that's visible in the morning skies before it seems to kind of appear. It gets high in the sky, it makes this weird kind of shape before it disappears with the sun. Then it disappears with the sun, goes to the underworld, if you want to call it that, for 50 days before it reemerges as an evening star. And it's available in that apparition for, again, 263 days. Right? So it goes from a morning star, 263 days, disappears for 50 days, comes back as an evening star, 263 days. Then it disappears again. But this time it's only gone for 8 days before it reemerges as a morning star. So the whole ceremony tied around when it reemerges as a morning star again, right? That 584-day cycle is known as Venus's synodic cycle, and it ties in with its orbit around the Earth. You know, the 50 days is when it's on the far side of the sun. The 8 days is when it's between us and the sun, kind of slingshots around much faster. So you can see these planetary dynamics playing out within these traditions. And of course, the white rope that is holding Bannerbeer, which you see reflected in these beautiful morning star poles, these giant poles with white feathers that go down the side and the big tuft of feathers on top. The tuft of feathers on top is Venus. It's the Bannerbeer. But these strings that come down are supposed to represent that white sort of rope that ties her to Venus. The white rope is zodiacal light. It's this interplanetary dust that we see. You can't see it unless you get really dark skies. The Torres Strait, I've seen it plenty of times. It's almost like a triangular column of light that goes up into the sky, right? And because it's called zodiacal light, it's the path of the sun. It's interplanetary dust that sunlight's reflecting off of. It's going to be straddling the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun. And Venus, because it's a planet, is always going to be in that. So that white rope is zodiacal light. And you can see the astronomy in that. And if you're not an astronomer, you wouldn't think much of it. You'd think, oh, white light, a white rope, it's symbolic, whatever. It's actually zodiacal light. It's something you can physically see in the sky. It's got an actual, scientific meaning and purpose. And that, I start learning about this stuff from these communities. And I'm sitting with an elder in the Torres Strait. They've also got a ceremony at that time of the year. It's called Kek. And their ceremony is very similar to the Kulamas ceremony. And they're talking about stuff. And one of the others says, oh, later in the year, around November, when you've just got a couple of weeks before the monsoon hits, which happens to be right around the summer solstice, which is right around, and right around Christmas time, right? But there's this light, and he puts his hands together like this. And it says this light that goes straight directly up in the sky, it almost goes to the very top. And you'll see that, and that tells you that the monsoon's going to be here in about 2 or 3 weeks. And he didn't say zodiacal light, but I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, is he talking about the zodiacal light? I've never heard of any culture anywhere in the canon of the history of science talking about zodiacal light even having a predictive purpose, much less even what zodiacal light is. Some astronomers thought that Galileo had discovered zodiacal light. And I'm looking at this, and I go on to my software like Stellarium, and sure enough, from that latitude, in the evening, from the Torres Strait, when the sun goes down and it gets quite dark, the zodiacal light, the ecliptic is pointing straight up almost to zenith. I was like, oh my God, I've never seen that before. It's wild to think about. So I know I've kind of got off on my own tangent here, but when we start unpacking these ceremonies and these things tied around the stars, you can see the symbolism come out, but you can see the real astronomy come out too. So is it literal? Is it symbolic? Well, it's both.
I mean, it really raises so the big bifurcation for me is are these peoples looking at something like Venus and telling similar stories because there's something inherent in our own experience with trying to ascend above some ideal, for instance, or is it a conserved story because we all have common ancestors and we've really kept these motifs alive for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years?
What's that mean with the girl saying, why not both?
Yeah.
It could be a factor of both. So in some cases, it's clearly going to be some, you're going to have, if you look at Polynesia, right? You're going to have very clear origin stories, right? That spread out. And they change and evolve with their own little variations of that. But they're going to have similar origins. Now, on a global scale, is this the case? This is an awesome topic. And in fact, I've got a PhD student here at University of Melbourne that I'm co-advising. She's in psychology. Her name is Bridget Kelly. And she's doing her PhD in psychology, co-advised by 3 other psychology professors. And we're looking at this exact issue. Why are the same groups of stars seen in such remarkably similar ways by cultures spread across space and time? why is this the case? And there's so much cool stuff to unpack here. So one of the things that comes out of that is the idea that, okay, well, there's a few particular groups of stars that almost every culture in the world has stories about. They tend to be the stars in Orion and the Pleiades, right? Which coincidentally happen to be aligned in the sky in a particular, sort of declination, the equivalent of latitude in the sky, where most cultures in the world can see them. So they're not too far south, where only southern hemisphere cultures can see that. They're not too far north, They're right along that midline, so everybody in the world can see them.
Very memorable too, right?
They're incredibly conspicuous, right? Very distinct shape. Those 3 stars of Orion's belt and those other 4 stars make it look like a human figure. Now, what's interesting about Orion, oftentimes seen as a man or a group of men in Australia, many cultures see it as a man in the exact same shape and orientation as the Greek version, which means in Australia, he's upside down. And they give reasons why he's upside down. And the scabbard of Orion's sword was never his scabbard. And they described it, it's exactly what the old traditions did. The scabbard of Orion's sword came out in the Victorian era when they were trying to clean things up a little bit, right?
That confirms to what I've always suspected.
Yes, it is. It's exactly.
That seems a little PG.
But the funny thing is, you've got Orion, you've got the most obvious, beautiful star cluster, the Pleiades right there, right? And then you got the V shape of stars between them, the Hyades. See, Orion, Hyades, Pleiades. And when you find stories all around the world, they're diurnal motion as they move across the sky, moving from east to west. Orion is always chasing the Pleiades. But between them is this V shape of stars that can often be described as a protector, right? So the old Greek mythology didn't, they're seen in the sky as Orion's chasing the girls, the 7 sisters of the Pleiades, and he falls in love with them. And it's Taurus the bull who's sort of protecting them. Even though that's in the celestial version, it was never actually in the Greek version. Of course, there are tons of variations of Greek mythology. There's no unifying, this is Greek mythology. There's tons of islands and regions across Greece. Same as in Australia. There's hundreds of languages across Australia. Each one's distinct. And you find similar trends in some of them. And this is one of them you find. Down here, you find similar stories. And there's a very common songline that goes all the way across the country, the story of the 7 sisters, Nairuna, or Watiniru. It's a sort of a bad man, right? He's this womanizer, and he's trying to pursue the young girls, the Pleiades. They're too young for him, they're shy, and they're of the wrong skin. They mean by wrong skin in Australia means that because the communities, you don't have tons and tons of people around, you have to find ways of maintaining genetic diversity. Otherwise, you get a little bit too, I'm not going to name off American states, that'll get me in trouble, but you know what I mean.
British royalty.
Yeah, British royalty, that's it, right? So they had, these very complex marriage classes and kinship classes that he were allowed to be around and relate to maintain that. Anyway, he was of the wrong skin for them. So, but he's constantly pursuing them and trying to trick them, but they're too smart for him, right? But they're described as 7 sisters, and many of the variations of the story describe the 7th sister as disappearing and then coming back sometimes. So this idea of there being 7 sisters and then one of them disappears, either permanently or temporarily, is a very common motif all around the world, right? So why is this the case? What is it with that 7th sister? Why does that 7th sister disappear? Well, we started looking into this. Right?
Well, there's only 6 of them visible, right, in the Pleiades today?
Well, yeah, but it depends on how good your vision is, how good the seeing conditions are. If you're an experienced observer in ideal conditions and you've got good eyesight, you can actually see more than that. You can see 7, 8, 9, 12 even, if you're really good. But this is where it gets interesting, right? So why is this the case? So we start looking into this, and we're trying to unpack this. And we've got different hypotheses. I want to say different theories. We've got different hypotheses we're testing. Now, one of them was from my PhD advisor, Ray Norris, and his son, who ended up following his footsteps and becoming an astrophysicist. They wanted to look at the common origin story hypothesis. Is it because we had this story in Africa before we dispersed across the world? So why would that be the case? What would it matter? Well, if you go back 100,000 years ago, there's the seven brightest stars in the Pleiades. Two of them that are kind of off on one side a little bit, Atlas and Pleione, right? Pleione is the seventh brightest of those stars. They're so close to each other. They're just about 5 arc minutes apart, which is extremely difficult, almost impossible for our eyes to resolve the two separate stars, right? You go back 100,000 years ago, they were just far enough apart where you could resolve them. Is that what it is? So he made that argument. It's a pretty decent argument. I'm not sure it's the one that I think is the right one, but then I don't know. So we were looking at other options. Well, all of the stars of the Pleiades are variable stars. They all change in brightness over time. Pleione changes by a pretty noticeable degree, a couple of tenths of a magnitude, with a periodicity of about 35 years. So is it that when it's at its brightest, it's just visible enough for us to see and then it disappears and comes back 35 years later? Maybe. A colleague of mine says, he's Bradley Schaefer, who's a now retired astrophysicist from Baton Rouge at Louisiana State. Extremely good astronomer, astrophysicist, also does a lot of work in testing naked eye observations of claims in archaeoastronomy and history of astronomy. He goes out and tests them, and he's saying, no, they're too close together. You're not going to resolve that. So we're looking at other ideas. What else could it be? And then I started to notice something. I started to realize that I was asking the question the wrong way because of my own researcher bias. My own bias is thinking of this in very literal terms. There's the stars. There's either 7 or there's 6. Something must change within the boundaries of this cluster that's causing that to happen. Maybe it is, but what I'm also finding is that, the stars in the central desert of Australia talk about the seventh sister, Kambudaga. She is the Hyades. She's protecting her younger sisters. And she's trying to draw Wachiniru's attention to herself. And she's mocking and humiliating him, right? And there's stuff in there that talks about variable stars, which was pretty amazing. There's all kinds of cool astronomy stuff in there, but I don't want to digress on that path. We'll be here for the next 6 days. So that story, the seventh sister is the Hyades. Not even a star. It's that whole that giant cluster of stars. When I went out to Perth a couple of years ago, I was in the museum, and one floor was dedicated to 2 topics: Indigenous astronomy and meteorites. I was in absolute heaven. Those are my 2 favorite topics, and my favorite area of Indigenous astronomy is the meteorite stuff, right? So I'm just loving this, and I'm watching this big animation they have out, and they're talking about this song line, and they said the seventh sister is the planet Jupiter. And I forget how many years it is, 8 years, 12 years, whatever it is. I think it's 12 years. Jupiter comes back around in conjunction with the Pleiades, either directly in there or very close to it. That's the seventh sister coming back. So I'm starting to realize, okay, I was thinking about this in the wrong terms. I'm thinking about it's within this cluster of stars, but it might not be within the cluster of stars. It could be something outside that. Islam, the seventh sister, is the stone that fell from heaven, which is the one in Mecca, which is believed to be a meteorite. That's the seventh sister, taking physical form. And you find all around Australia and around the world, the stories that talk about things happening up in the sky, there's a terrestrial counterpart. So early in our conversation, I told you about those Tasmanian stories that go back 12,000 years from Moe and Andromedy. Moe and Andromedy were brothers that ended up fighting and falling down to the earth. And there's 2 landmarks in Tasmania. And people will say, well, if they fell down to the earth, doesn't that mean they're not going to be in the sky anymore? I said, no. As is above, so is below. Every star, every celestial object has a counterpart on the earth. That is its counterpart, right? So I started realizing that I was thinking about these things in the wrong terms. So that was part of that Orion Pleiades discussion. And there's still other possibilities. And I'm hoping before too long to maybe, edit a volume and have different academics kind of come together and discuss this. But that's that idea. There's the other idea. What about the constellations themselves? Why are they seen in such remarkably similar ways? Why is Orion is always usually seen as something masculine? as a man or a group of men? Why are the Pleiades seen as feminine? Gemini, the twins. Well, not too hard to figure out. Two bright stars kind of close to each other. Okay. There's lots of other groups of stars that have similar kinds of associations. Two things I realized about those. Number one, again, by researcher bias, Orion isn't always seen as a man, and the Pleiades aren't always seen as women. But confirmation bias tells me that I'm looking up these stories, I'm going to remember the ones where they're similar, and I'm kind of ignoring all the ones that don't fit into that, right? So I think if we were to go through and do a really detailed, rigorous analysis, which I'm hoping to get a PhD student on soon to do, maybe it wouldn't be quite as common as we think it is. Maybe it's just our bias is picking those out. But even if you did have 30 from around the world, that'd still be pretty interesting. But the other one, as it turns out, with Bridget and her research, she showed something quite remarkable. And the colleagues and I published a few papers in psychology journals and in Nature Astronomy, that we were looking at the hypothesis, is it something about human perception? So we utilize Gestalt principles, how humans recognize patterns. We're pattern-seeking creatures. I mentioned this before, right? That's how we experience pareidolia. It's how we can see Jesus' face in a piece of toast kind of thing. You know, you're going to have that kind of pattern recognition and assign meaning and agency to that. And what we found out, we used the 27 different star culture constellations on Stellarium as a test case. And we did this complex mathematical analysis to show similarities and the types of groups of stars that kept being repeated over and over. And we found out that a very good explanation for why these constellations are seen in similar ways is because as humans, we have a fundamental way of seeing the world around us, and we naturally gravitate towards those same types of patterns. Right.
So they look like it's a boar because it looks like a boar, or it's a man because it looks like a man.
A chariot, it looks like a chariot. Exactly, right? You know, or Gemini twins because they're two bright stars close to each other, you know. So we decided to not only test that, but then to experiment. And this is something that was really cool. And Bridget's doing work on this. She's about to submit her thesis in a couple of months. And I can't wait for her to finish this up and start really getting this out to the world. It's amazing stuff.
Congratulations.
We decided, yes, I can't wait. She's been working on this for a few years, and it's awesome. What's really cool, we decided to experiment with this. And what we did is we put people, we would do it during these big festivals, right, where lots of people come together, and put them in a planetarium dome, and we'd simulate a night sky that you don't see. Now, instead of doing like a Monte Carlo type thing, what we did is we used a program like Stellarium, and we zoomed into a tiny patch of the sky and blew it out to like the normal sky. So you're actually looking at stars that actually exist, but you'd see it in the sky as a little patch, but we've blown it up. So now what looks like all new constellations in the sky. All right, the Milky Way is still in the same place, but all the other stars are different. There's new patterns, right? So we had people go in with iPads, right? Come up with your own constellations and names and meanings of what you think they are. And people were going in having a lot of fun with this. They were coming up with their own constellations. And when we did the analysis, we found something remarkable. People were coming up with remarkably similar patterns in how they were perceiving these groups of stars. But there was a difference. Now, I don't remember exactly what the specific difference was. I have to look it up now. I feel I should have read this paper again. It's been a few months now. There was a difference between how people grouped these stars into constellations that were very similar, but they were in two distinct groups. And the two distinct groups of whether or not those people come from a culture that's very individualistic or very communal. So if you take 100 Americans and 100 Chinese and have them go into a planetarium, come up with their own constellations, the Americans are going to come up with similar constellations, the Chinese are going to come up with similar constellations, but they're not going to be the same as each other. That how we form constellations, these Gestalt principle types of ideas, depends on our politics and our upbringing about how we see things working together.
Were they bringing in modern artifacts, or were they very animistic?
Like, this is the iPad constellation.
Yeah. So
some people were doing that. Some people were doing that. Yeah. Whatever you want. It's whatever idea. It doesn't have to be, animistic. It can be, If this
Did
is,
you find
you
that
know,
people were drawn more towards an animist frame, or was it a lot of technological and man-made objects that they were seeing?
it was people were seeing hearts, the old shape of a heart. They were seeing kind of things that they could relate to in a very easy way, things that were more familiar to them. So I want to go back into this paper. I sort of bring it up now. I get all excited, but I haven't read the paper in God probably almost a year now. I've forgotten most of it, but I can send it across.
Yeah, we can drop it in
But
the comments
it
or
was
in
it
the
was what was
description.
familiar to people. So in most people's day-to-day life, aside from their pet, they don't see animals.
Yeah,
Most
I mean,
people
so
in
much is
cities,
so it's really crazy because you see the way that we interact with nature and build our conceptions of what the world looks like. And most people spend their entire lives in a built environment. And maybe there's a park and there's some greenery and there's, you have the pigeons and the raccoons and whatever species have managed to carve a niche out for themselves in an urban environment. But for the most part, there's just no real relationship to wilderness.
yeah. So people, if they were relating to animals, they tend to be animals they recognize from stories, books, you know. So it was really interesting because we want to do more work on this. We're wanting to do something where people had to come up with a story for their constellation and then share that through multiple generations of people and then see if those people could recognize it. We're trying to test both sides of that. There's the pattern recognition and creation of constellations, but there's also the stories about the meetings of those constellations, which is really difficult and maybe it could be seen as a little bit problematic. I mean, we haven't done it yet. It's almost like trying to replicate these oral systems of knowledge transmission of lab.
That must be hard to do because if the case is made that the reason that the oral transmission was so important was because it was a question of life or death, that it's a
Well,
lot
yeah,
harder
right.
to recreate in the laboratory where you're just,
I want to try it though. I'm going to try this with my students this year. It's
that'll be
just a
really
really
good.
interesting
But it's also
task.
don't forget the reward and punishment aspect of that.
So
Like
electric
I remember doing
shocks.
this. Well, maybe not going that far. Maybe I don't know. Here's a $50 voucher or something. I don't know. Whatever it happens to be. I just remember when we did this in school. We did it in social studies class, and I remember the one guy who was the class clown. Of course, as soon as it got to him, I knew he was going to change it. He was laughing and giggling, and the people at the end wouldn't even repeat to the teacher because it was so crude. And I was just like, this is what people think hearsay is. And to a degree, they're kind of right a little bit. But hearsay is how we think of anything that isn't written down is considered hearsay. Our legal system, if it's not written down, it's hearsay. So then all oral tradition would be considered hearsay. And I've heard people say that. Well, how can you rely on oral tradition? It's just hearsay. I'm like, oh, no, it is not hearsay. It doesn't work that way at all. So the biggest challenge in doing all of this is getting rid of these misconceptions about what people think it is and what it isn't. And then we can actually move forward with trying to understand this stuff a bit easier. And also the implications this has on education. I sit with these poor students in my classes. I teach physics 1. Most of those students don't want to be there. They have to be there. Only a handful of physics majors. The rest of them want to do engineering or some other science. They don't want to sit through first year physics. They're in this sterile lecture hall, round with the front, writing equations or talking off a PowerPoint presentation because everything's delivered online these days. I don't even probably write anything anymore. Maybe do a couple of goofy demonstrations with things that have been around since the 50s. The students are disengaged. No matter how much I sing and dance for them, they're just like, ugh, because they're put in this sterile environment. And of course, they're on their phones, checking TikTok or whatever it is, trying to stay alive. Half of them are falling asleep. It's a horrible learning environment. And the same with the other classes I teach. Even on this very topic, we're still in lecture halls, and I still have to teach in that. I can't just take them outside. It doesn't work that way. Maybe for one lecture I can, because it has to be recorded, and the recording cameras are facing me, and all the students who aren't in the class have to be able to access lecture. We're forced to teach in this sterile environment. But when I do take the students outside, maybe I teach Indigenous astronomy first semester of every year. And I have this one lecture where I bring in a shoe swap shaman. So John Paul Eagleheart, he shows. So the shoe swap people are from Lake Okanagan area of Canada, right? And he's in his 60s. He's trained his whole life as a practicing shaman. He went through all the levels of initiation. And he comes in, he takes the class outside, and they sit in a circle, right? We found a courtyard area we can do this in. And he's in full regalia, and he brings in the sage, which he burns and passes around. The students are sitting in a circle. And he leads the students through a medicine wheel ceremony. And as he's doing the ceremony with the students, he's asking them questions and asking them what to look out for. And, there's all the astronomy side of that, but there's also just the connection that people have. Listen to the birds. What are they telling you? What do you feel with the breeze? How do you feel the soil under your feet? All these things. He's trying to get the students into a multi-sensory experience. And the students are into it. They're so into it. They love it. And at the end of this, they come out of the class remembering everything he said. And every single one of them, they give the end of the semester review. That was their favorite lecture. That's the one they remember. And of course, they're out of this sterile environment and they're learning by doing, multi-sensory. On that note, not to digress too much, that created a bit of a funny situation. You can imagine an associate professor of physics in the courtyard of the physics building during lunch, when there's about 1 million people walking by with coffee and lunch, seeing a whole bunch of undergraduate students in a circle with the shaman standing up praying to the 4 directions and passing around burning sage. You can imagine the looks we got from that. What in the hell is going on here? The funny thing was, the senior academics who all know me were like, oh, they didn't exactly know what was going on, but they trusted me that I knew what I was doing. A lot of the graduate students, or some of the undergrads in particular, were like smirking and laughing and thought it was hilarious. And other people were just wondering about, like, what the hell is going on? I gave a seminar 2 weeks. Well, during that class, I saw a couple of undergrads walk by and start smirking and making comments. And I broke the circle and went in. I had a bit of a go at them. I was like, well, what's so funny? And they thought that, I was teaching astrology. And I was like, do you think we teach astrology in the physics department at the University of Melbourne? No, that's not what we're doing. And I thought maybe I should explain to people exactly what's going on. So I gave a department colloquium for physics. About a week later, I said, shamans are science. What the hell is going on? That's how I named the talk. And I brought everybody in and I explained to them. As an experiential learning process, number one, students learn better by doing. Students are going to learn better by being involved in multi-sensory experience as opposed to the sterile environment. They just got to sit there and stare at you while you're yammering on, as I do. But also, you can have an anthropologist come in and talk about, which is basically what we're doing now, really, talk about this medicine wheel ceremony and what it means in the sterile environment. Students are nodding off, trying to stay awake. Or you can take them out and have them do it. Right. And they're going to learn so much more. And they do learn so much more by doing it. And they love it. And they're engaged. And when I told the students we're going to have this lecture, it's the only lecture of the entire semester all the students came to. So how we deliver content, how we do this, how we actually teach is highly embedded within these ancient ways of storytelling, of multisensory experience, of being outside. You talk about the philosophy professor who takes the students outside and they sit in a circle, and some people kind of laugh at it. I'm like, oh, they're doing exactly what we need to do. That's exactly how you should be doing it. But also how you can change assessments around that to give students a chance to utilize these ancient ways of knowing that we've had for our entire evolutionary history that we've lost touch with only recently. So that Lucasa I was telling you about, the memory devices I talked about earlier, how you associate method to loci, memory to place. The students, I bring Lynn Kelly in, who wrote the books on this, and she learned this from the elders and got their permission and actually paid them intellectual rights for us to be able to do this. So they've been compensated for that. She brings in small bits of plywood, about the size of a large mobile phone. She goes to thrift stores and op shops and gets tons of beads and shells and whatever stuff. Brings in, the students have to memorize the Western 88 constellations, right? They've got to commit all of them to memory, and they've got to recite them all using their memory device. So they go around, they get to select all the beads and shells, and they get to put them in whatever order you want. I don't care how you do it, as long as you do it. So that's 20% of their assessment of the whole semester is memorizing the 88 constellations using that indigenous memory technique. And I've had students, it's been kind of wild because some of them never finished their Lukasa, but they created a new one later on. One guy did it off the back of a used pizza box, and he did it like chunks of cheese and sauce. He's like, well, this reminds me of, this constellation. He sat and did the whole thing off the back of the pizza box. Maybe he did it the night before. I don't know. Good on him if he was able to memorize it all. If he can do it that fast, great. But I've had those students come to me. I've run across them on campus a year or 2 years later, and they said that changed everything about how I do undergraduate now. Like they were doing medicine. One was doing medicine, one was doing linguistics, and one was doing chemistry. And they've been utilizing those memory techniques and finding them to be incredibly powerful. Well, they are incredibly powerful. That's the whole exciting part about this. And there's all kinds of other techniques you can utilize. So this whole thing about, utilizing constellation ideas and pattern recognition, method of loci, how we understand astronomy, the real world application of this, in addition to understanding ancient and indigenous cultures better, getting a deeper appreciation for them, that's more impactful and more respectful, acknowledging the importance and depth of their knowledge, not saying it's good because we recognize it now, but it's already inherently good. It doesn't need Western validation. It's good and it's amazing and powerful in its own right. How that can actually come together with modern Western science, and these two worlds can inform each other, there's lots of other examples, and how we can teach and how we can sort of go back to some of those old ways that were so effective, the storytelling, go back to the memory, the method of loci, go back, have students create songs, say, make a song about this. If you create a song about this, you're going to remember it. And students do that. And even in physics, they're doing that. I'm like, create a song about this equation. And they think I'm taking the piss, like it's a big joke or something. I'm like, no, come on, try it. They do it, and like actually they remembered it. Like later in the semester, what was that song about? And you rattle it off, and they memorize their equations doing that. So it's really powerful.
I mean, I think I don't know that humans can live without mythology. And so, I feel like it's going to be there whether we acknowledge it or not. And I wonder what place it will take in the future. As will it live in Marvel movies or will it be something more in the sacred spaces? Will it be an academic pursuit? It's very unclear to me in this modern age.
I think there's a lot of beauty in teaching students to reconnect to that. Because as you're talking about the value of going outside and embodying the things that you're learning and thinking about them in this mythological way and trying to place them into your own memory in a way that you wouldn't have normally thought of, I feel like that's exactly what's necessary as the environment around us starts to disintegrate, where it becomes more and more difficult to hold on to something. It becomes more and more difficult to maintain attention on the way that people have done things for the last, 100, 200, 300 years. It makes sense that something older would bubble back up again, and to say that this is what has kept us going for tens of thousands of years, right? We're looking at these stories where you're saying, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 years ago, if that story still exists, that's a story of a culture that made it. Like, these are the lessons to take, because we're looking around, we're like, I don't know if we're going to make it or not. So we probably should learn something from the people that have survived. And so it's really
100%. 100% exactly right. We need to go back and relearn that, because with this sterilized learning environments, these standardized tests, the stripping away of education to be just this uniform, homogeneous, lowest common denominator, it's a horrible way of learning. And it's no wonder people are so engaged or disengaged from school and why they hate it so much. I know there's a few schools out there, who've gone back to those ways, and the kids are outside all day long and they're engaging, and there's a few different schools who do that, which tend to be very elite and very expensive and very hard to get into kinds of places. And I feel like I'm even here in my little tiny academic role, I'm trying to chip away at that as much as I can. But even university bureaucracy and administration, not just here but everywhere, is trying to homogenize everything within the university. And they expect the way that you teach things in the sciences and the humanities to be exactly the same. And those two areas couldn't be further apart. But that synergy, where they do link together, is where you find exciting innovations, and that's where you find different ways of doing this kind of stuff. but everything gets so compartmentalized and siloed into little individualized areas. We're losing track of the importance of interdisciplinary, and that's become the big buzzword over the years: interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary. Senior managers in universities love banging on about that, but they never enable it. They talk about it. In some places, you have to show it's interdisciplinary. It's easy for me to do, but they don't support it because these different disciplines work in such different areas. The way you do things in one area is exactly the polar opposite of the way you do it in the other area. And the way each sees the other doing it, they see it as the wrong way. Now, it's within that context because we've been so siloed. When you start working together, you find amazing innovation. I'm reminded people telling me back at this period, I forget when it was, 50s, 60s, whatever it was. There was some huge NASA campus, and they were having to renovate one of the buildings. So they had taken all the engineers and the scientists, people, and put them all in one area. So we're having to go and eat lunch together. And as they're in the cafeteria eating lunch together, they said that more innovation came out that 6 or 8 month period than had been the previous 10 years, because the engineers were getting to talk to the scientists and the software developers and the whomever else it was that happened to be there. I don't remember all the gory details, but that crossover of them sitting and having lunch or having coffee or having a beer and just chatting about this stuff and answering those questions and working on these new ideas, a lot of exciting stuff came about that because they moved outside of their silos. But universities are pushing so much for that now. It's not the way we did things before. When you look at Indigenous, traditional Indigenous education, they don't silo things away like that. You can't. Everything's related. Everything's intertwined. You can't have it separated so easily.
It's really hard to measure things that aren't clearly binned. Like, you can't make metrics of something to say that, like, this is how much grant money we got for this thing, and this is how much money we can put towards the stadium from this discipline
or
versus
what your
that
credential
discipline.
is in.
Like, we're so obsessed with being able to parameterize and fold everything that we do into some kind of larger standardized system that, part of the reason that we're doing the project that we're doing is because we really want to have this library of ideas that's really cross-disciplinary, so that people who are interested in everything from mythology to economics to quantum physics to the origin of life can come and find all of these ideas. And we don't have like you mentioned several times during our conversation, you're like, I don't know if this is the right answer. I don't know if a lot of the ideas that we have on the show are the right answer. And so the goal is to have as many possibilities that seem like they could be, so that 50 years down the road, these are the seeds for the next generation for thinking about how nature actually works. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and to share your knowledge and your studies and to give us this new way of looking at the world.
And sounds like you're being one of the cool professors too. So I'm sure we could use more of that.
I try.
Yeah. No, but it's
so much
important.
For having me on.
And
where can people find you?
Yeah, I want to hear about that paper when it comes out too. I hope that you'll keep us in mind, or we can stay in touch because.
Yeah, look. So there's a couple of points we can go to immediately. The first is, I'm shameless. So I did write a book called The First Astronomers, which I wrote 2 years ago with 6 elders. It's global in scope. It's not just Australian. There is a focus on Australia, but it is global scope. And I've got everything from every corner of the world is in here. It's about the science of Indigenous astronomy. All of the royalties of the book go to charity. I don't make any money off the book. In fact, I've only lost money on the book, but that's not why I wrote it. But I wrote it with 6 elders, 1 Aboriginal and 6 Torres Strait Islander elders. But there's stuff in here from all over the place. Right here is Mercy stuff from Africa and Ethiopia. There's stuff from Greenland. There's stuff from Quechua in South America. There's stuff everywhere. So there's this book. There is a website, aboriginalastronomy.com.au, which is a huge repository of research papers and information, curricula. We're writing Indigenous astronomy into the Australian national curricula for all subjects at all school levels, from grade 1 to grade 12. So that's all out there. And there's plenty of resources out there, but I've also got amazing colleagues around the world who've done similar stuff to this. So Rangi Matamua is a Maori. professor, and he wrote a book on Maori astronomy called Matariki, the Star of the Year. Matariki refers to the Pleiades as a seasonal marker. And a colleague named Annette Lee. Annette Lee is awesome. Annette Lee is a Lakota woman. She's an astrophysicist, PhD astrophysicist, and she's got 2 MFAs, a BFA and 2 MFAs. She's a professional artist, and she runs a program called Native Sky Watchers out of Minnesota. So she does a lot of phenomenal work in this space. There's lots of people who are now working in the Indigenous astronomy space all around the world. A colleague named Chris Cannon at the University of Alaska is about to publish his book on First Nations astronomy, which I believe is the Northern Dina, sort of Alaska, Northern Canada region. So lots of stuff you can find on there, and of course you can find my gory details online at the university website or on social media.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Duane. And we'll follow up on those names. We'd love to have more conversations. So thank you for mentioning
Excellent.
them.
Cheers.
Yeah, we'll link your book down below too. Everybody check it out. Get some books. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, sir. You're just getting started. We're going down. We're at the end of our hours. But
Yes, I'm in grant writing mode now, so time to get going on that.
all right.
Best of luck.
Good luck. More coffee.
All right. Cheers. Thanks.
See you, Duane.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.